Okay, it is 9 o'clock. Good morning. Good morning, everyone. It is 9 o'clock. Oh, there's Ashley. Okay, I was worried too. Because of all the weather on the East Coast, we've had to move some of the discussants around a little bit. So Waverly could not make it today to be the discussant because of travel and some other issues. So Ashley, who was originally on one of the, she's one of the foremost penologists. We have like an incredibly deep and wide bench here. So when folks are on panels and people have been really flexible. So Ruben stood in for Michael Walker yesterday, and now today Ashley will be the discussant for, Ashley Rubin will be the discussant for the Community Engaged Methods panel. So not only is she one of the foremost penologists I've been able to have the pleasure of meeting, she's also written a book called Rocking Qualitative Methods. So what Rocking Qualitative Social Sciences, sorry about that. And she'll introduce the panel for Community Engaged Methods. Today, we're going to be a little more practically focused. Even when you tell academics you have 5 minutes to talk about your research agenda and 10 minutes to talk about the policy implications, I think we averaged a flip of that. It was 10 minutes on their research and 5 minutes on policy. Some people actually follow directions, but that's why this group is this group, because nobody's hating. I know how this group is. So that's why you all are here too. I tried to give you some general guidelines. That worked out as best it could. So I appreciate Ivy for keeping us on time, and to respect the timekeeper and respect the panels today as well. I'm going to have Ashley come up and introduce everybody on the panel. There's one small change. I would actually like Sophia to go last, if that's okay with everyone. So Ashley Rubin, come on up, introduce your panel.
Okay, good morning, everyone. John, thank you so much for organizing this and for inviting us, inviting me as well. Thank you so much to the Watson Institute, the Urban Institute, Ivy, Chloe, and everyone who has made this day possible. Okay, so exciting panel. So I'm going to go in the order of the program, and then I'm going to invite, I'll do one person at a time, right? Sorry. So we will start with Brooklyn Hitchens, who is an assistant professor of criminology and criminal justice at the University of Maryland.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
And the clicker, this thing here, right? Can I just make sure? Is it just the center? Okay, all right. Okay. Good morning, everyone. My name is Brooklyn Hitchens, and I'm an assistant professor in criminology and criminal justice at the University of Maryland. I'm a sociologist by training and a critical criminologist who studies the complex lived experiences of low-income Black communities with issues such as gun violence and policing. So I zero in on how inequities in race, class, and gender shape their participation in crime, risk for victimization, and involvement with the criminal legal system. So this work today will hopefully lead us into a discussion on how we as researchers can do a better job at working with the criminalized populations we study. So I offer a methodological framework first created by Dr. Yasser Payne called Street Participatory Action Research, or Street PAR, to engage the streets of Black America. By the streets, I mean the disproportionately hard to reach subgroup of low-income Black populations that understand criminal behavior as an adaptive response to adverse structural conditions. So folks, caught in illegal activities, bonding activities, those incarcerated and formerly incarcerated, and those who face various levels of structural precarity. And I've worked with street-identified Black populations in cities like Wilmington, Delaware, Philadelphia, Boston, Baltimore, and Brooklyn, New York for the last 14 years. So 2 overarching questions that focus my talk on community engaged methods are: how do we manage the social value of our research and obligations to research participants? And how do we leverage our research findings towards community programming, activism, and or grassroots organizing, right? So to what do we owe the people who lend us their stories, their data, their trauma, their suffering, but also their resilience? Research is inherently extractive, but there are things we can do to mitigate harm and add to the communities that we study. So one answer I offer is PAR, Participatory Action Research. PAR is a long-standing methodological tradition that spans education, psychology, anthropology, public health, etc., and prioritizes including members of the population of interest onto the research team. And this can be any target population, right? From homeless youth to reproductive activists to single mothers. Critical to PAR, though, is that these team members are included in all phases of the research process, from project design, questions, theoretical framing, methods analysis, co-authorship, and conference presentations. Street PAR is a more aggressive iteration of PAR and trains street-identified and or formerly incarcerated persons to do activism and empirically document the lived experiences of other street-identified populations. PAR requires a social justice response. That is research that intentionally addresses, or at least works to address, the social inequalities that participants experience within the research process, but also in their everyday lives. But the field of criminology has been slow to adopt more emancipatory, participatory, and translational research models when engaging with marginalized populations. There are a lot of reasons for this, which some of we can probably guess, but part of it is due to difficulties in accessing justice-involved or captive populations, as we sometimes call them. But the more uncomfortable truth is that many of us, even sometimes the well-meaning ones, struggle with seeing the value or practicality of including these folks in the research process. Oftentimes, sometimes even in our pseudo attempts at objectivity, which we can talk more about. PAR then is indeed an epistemological shift in the location of power and knowledge. So how do we do it? What does this look like in practice? Street PAR prioritizes bringing the doctoral model to the street corner. That means training street-identified populations similar to how we train our doc students. Classroom, workshop style trainings, that meet multiple times a week. For example, in one recent PAR project, we met 3 to 4 times a week for 3 to 4 hours per session in a local community center. Street PAR members completed 18 research workshops with a focus on critical theories, methods, analysis, and activism. So we teach them sampling. We teach them regression. We teach them qualitative methods. And we don't really water down those trainings because we believe that they can learn too. And we do all of this to get folks ready for on-the-ground data collection. We task our street PAR team with collecting large quantitative and qualitative samples of hard-to-reach Black populations. So folks who researchers notoriously struggle to engage due to legacies of mistrust and mistreatment, which we're all aware of. PAR projects are strengthened by the social capital, the credibility, and the skill sets of the street PAR team. And we gathered this population and we asked them a myriad of questions on policing, on violence, health, incarceration, housing. So here's a snapshot from a 45-page survey instrument we administered to over 700 street-identified Black folks in Wilmington, Delaware. As a PAR team, we also meet regularly for data meetings where we check in, we troubleshoot, and we update one another on the project goals and timeline. Central to the street PAR model is action or activism. And I've witnessed, firsthand how an empowered community ignites critical social change in their neighborhoods. So street PAR team members use the research skill set they've gained or garnered to enact criminal justice reform with the ACLU, to become violence interrupters who, settle disputes, and present study findings on academic panels. So associates are able to enhance their resume with professional experiences gleaned from the project, and then use those experiences to ensure quality employment and educational opportunities. So they wield the power of research, the power that we all know very well, to transform their lives and the lives of their community. So for example, on this bottom left photo is Jonathan, affectionately known as Run. So if Run were here, he'd tell you he was the problem, is something he'd say. He struggled with addiction for a long time, and he was actually shot on 3 different occasions. So on the 3rd time that he was shot, he became, paralyzed from the waist down. But Jonathan used the street PAR model to effectively transform his life. So he not only went back and got his doctorate, he runs a successful nonprofit in Southwest Philadelphia, and I work closely with Dr. Wilson on engaging youth in the city of Philadelphia who carry guns. Street PAR operates from a resilience framework that recognizes the phenomenological experiences of low-income Black populations in tandem with violent sociostructural conditions and how those two together create street life. So street PAR sees crime as resilience, or how street-identified persons or groups organize meaning around feeling well, satisfied, or accomplished, and how they choose to survive in relation to adverse structural conditions. So we prioritize their language and cultural worldview to do research differently. We also work to mitigate the extractive nature of research by providing the PAR team with a research skill set and a livable wage. How else do we intend to help folks transition from the streets or the criminal legal system if we don't pay them their worth and aid in their upward mobility? So we pay our team anywhere from $20 to $30 an hour, and we also pay our study participants anywhere from $30 to $70 for their participation. We also have open discussions about the allocation of resources. How often are we transparent with our participants about how much money, capital, and acclaim we achieve from their labor? So we discuss how our funding dollars are divvied up right from the onset, and we have honest conversations about the budget, the resources, and the incentives. So Street PAR engages the target population in the social justice process and gives the community control of how their data are accessed, collected, analyzed, and disseminated. And as a result, we believe that we gain culturally competent data that bolsters our conversation on carceral systems. And so with Street PAR, we recognize that abolition and decarceration is a long game. We push our local and state government towards criminal justice reform, most recently with a compassionate release bill that passed in the Delaware Senate. So we know, right, we're carceral scholars here. We know nationwide that we have a significant portion of older and infirmed incarcerated folks who are literally wasting their lives away in jail cells or prison cells. Black men make up over 57% of those imprisoned in Delaware for 30 years or more. And so with compassionate release, those long imprisoned folks have the opportunity to petition before a parole board and have their sentences reduced due to medical and or age-related reasons. We also make a case for a community-led IRB, which will allow marginalized groups to effectively control and protect the data extracted from their communities. So that includes researchers, politicians, and the media. And finally, we implore researchers to examine violence, to examine carcerality and harm in relation to the racial ethnic wealth gap. We advocate for a robust, comprehensive Black reparations plan as one of the only interventions that can realistically counter the legacy of structural violence and concentrated disadvantage that then leads to street life in Black America. So I think I'm a little early, and I will end there. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. Our next speaker is Shannon Malone Gonzalez, an assistant professor of sociology at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill.
Thank you for having me here today to talk about my research, but in particular to reflect upon my research process and the implications of that process for how we understand and measure police violence against Black women and girls. And I want to say that I really appreciated the opportunity to listen to folks yesterday and really this framing and thinking about abolition as a process, as a praxis, one that we can incorporate into our methods. And my work really looks at this process, both punishment processes, but also resistance, and what it means to include and exclude Black women from these processes of punishment and policies to address it. First, I'm going to give a brief overview, hopefully brief, of my project and the conditions faced when thinking about how we conceptualize police violence, specifically thinking about what does it mean to investigate experiences with police that are often rendered invisible in our data. Importantly, I'm not the first to think deeply about the invisibility surrounding Black women and girls' encounters with police. There's a long history of Black women, feminist scholars and activists speaking to this invisibility and working to undo it and promote safe conditions for Black women and girls, such as Kimberly Crenshaw, Andrea Ritchie, Treva Lindsay, Nicole Burroughs, and many, many other activists and scholars. Yet, this invisibility persists. And in 2020, during the midst of the uprisings and heightened attention to policing, many were still pushing back against the invisibility around Black women and girls' police encounters, calling out the ways they were excluded in our understandings of victims. But also, I'm going to talk about today how we exclude them in our policies by limiting conceptualizations of police violence to traffic or pedestrian stops, despite research and reports that show that Black women and girls encounter officers in other locations, as well as exclude police gender-based and sexual violences in our measurements. When thinking about and challenging how we investigate the invisible, or experiences on the margins of dominant conceptualizations of policing and violence, we have to understand how conditions of punishment that create the possibilities for violence are linked to and are very much the same conditions that determine how we create knowledge and definitions of violence. Thus, understanding and taking seriously epistemic violence is really important for investigating experiences rendered invisible. And here, I really like Christy Dotson's understanding of epistemic violence because it gets us to place the emphasis on the role of the listener, be they the person, the institution, or the policymakers, and the conditions that obfuscate Black women and girls' encounters. Here, she defines epistemic violence as a failure on the part of the listener to reciprocate communication and acknowledge or respond to the experience. More, she outlines how Black women's testimonies about their experiences become quieted or smothered through the inability to recognize Black women as legitimate knowledge producers, even when it comes to their own experiences, and how Black women then adjust the telling of their stories because they feel unsafe, again nodding to the link and conditions of disclosure to the conditions of violence. And last, the ways Black women recognize that others don't have the tools or frames then to understand their stories. Now, I argue in my work that this has real implications for how we have historically and continue to operationalize and measure police violence, make claims about its prevalence, and ultimately how these claims dictate our policies. In thinking about the barriers in accounting for Black women and girls' experiences with police, our databases and surveys that are often used to document violence, we have to think about the role of epistemic violence at every single level. Structurally, we have to account for how marginalized groups have historically been excluded from knowledge production processes and institutions, including research institutions and media, places that often determine which stories matter and which ones don't on our national stages. And in the absence of mandatory reporting of police violence from police departments in the United States, citizen groups, activists, and journalists have been filling in this structural gap by collating media and survivor reports to document encounters. However, there is limited demographic information and limited information on police gender-based and sexual violence, leading to the 21st Century Task Force on Policing to call for federal agencies to start collecting policing information on, quote, sexual harassment of and misconduct toward community members, and in particular LGBTQ and gender nonconforming people. Yet the African American Policy Forum Say Her Name report cautions that this is not just a fact of missing numbers, stating that the erasure of Black women and girls is not purely a matter of missing facts. Even where Black women and girls are even present in the data, narratives framing police profiling and lethal force as exclusively male experiences lead researchers, the media, and advocates to exclude them. In many ways, this means structurally accounting for epistemic violence, or what Moya Bailey terms misogynoir, which is how the ways Black women experience violence is tied to and linked to the delegitimization of their experiences across different contexts and institutions. Thus, institutionally, we have to account for the risk associated with reporting. Given the broader legal estrangement of Black populations and the lack of officer accountability, this means seeing Black women's underreporting as a structural problem, not necessarily a personal one, around speaking up, as whenever Black women do report, especially police gender-based and sexual violence, they run a risk of it not being taken seriously and thus incur a risk of officer retaliation. Interpersonally, we also have to account for what Beth Ritchie calls gender entrapment and the trap of loyalty, wherein Black women and girls are socialized into silence or to pursue a politics of respectability as a means of safety, as well as our push to put racial loyalty to the family and community above their own safety and well-being. This is really important because as research on police violence against Black women and girls has shown, and in my own research as well, I found that domestic and familial violence is a critical pathway to Black women's contact with police. And according to the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence, more than 40% of Black women have experienced some form of intimate partner violence in their lifetime. Thus, as many Black feminists have already argued, we have to account for police encounters outside of the traffic or pedestrian stop, as Black women encounter officers in other settings such as homes, schools, and any other place where officers are present and respond to crises. Individually, we also have to account for the ways women have internalized these broader structures, institutions, and interpersonal processes over the course of their lives. This can lead to many, which I found in my interviews, to downplay their encounters and underreport, and ultimately to doubt their own experiences because they have spent a lifetime and generations not seeing their experiences with police reflected in instruments, talks, medias, or policies aimed at capturing, measuring, and addressing police violence. Altogether, in investigating Black women's invisible experiences, we had to account for these structural, institutional, interpersonal, individual barriers that delegitimize and negate the ways Black women and girls encounter officers and experience police violence. In doing so, Dr. Yasmin Irizarry at UT Austin and I, my co-author on this part of the project, developed a pre-interview survey that aimed to account for the various ways Black women experience police violence. Drawing on previous research on policing and gender-based and sexual violence, we incorporated measures spanning physical assaults, sexual harassment, and assault and verbal intimidation. With Black women taking the survey before the interviews, I was able to observe their underreporting, particularly with instruments that were aimed at capturing them, and then probe for the interpersonal, institutional, and structural barriers to disclosure. And more, I was able to engage them in an interview around the survey and what could have been improved to better capture their encounters. As I continued talking to more Black women, we adapted the survey as I conducted interviews over the course of several years. And over time, the measures adapted to mirror how Black women were specifically describing and talking about their encounters and the harm they experienced from officers. And in the last set of interviews, Black women explicitly said how they were excited to talk to me because they saw for the first time in their lives their experiences reflected in the survey or something that they felt that legitimized their experiences. And last, we used the measures that we developed over time in a national survey spanning neglect, verbal and psychological abuse, sexual harassment, physical threats and assaults, sexual coercion and assault with Black women ages 18 plus. And today, given the time, I'm going to briefly provide one example in our ongoing research during this process that involved Black women in figuring out how do we capture sexual coercion and assault in our measures. And in Invisible No More in a Shrouded in Silence report, Andrea Ritchie describes how police sexual coercion involves officers using their power to engage in sexual conduct in exchange for leniency or favors. Scholars of policing, and particularly gender-based and sexual violence with police, emphasize institutional power and how officers can draw on these power anytime, regardless of being off duty or on duty. And at this point, I also want to give a warning. I'm going to share a story. And so for those who feel the need to take care of themselves, it's going to be a story of sexual coercion and assault. Gina, a Black middle-class woman in her 30s, specifically talks about this power and her decision to not report when she was sexually assaulted and coerced by police. In our interview, she notes several domestic disputes where she is sexually harassed and assaulted by police. Additionally, she discloses another experience in which an officer sexually assaulted her at a local bar. Out one night with friends, Gina had a domestic dispute with a friend, and the officer was called. The responding officer took advantage of restraining Gina to grope her, saying, quote, "And while he was grabbing me, he was grabbing all up against my body too. I'm like, get off me. I had, of course, a little dress on because I'm going out, and he just grabbed me when we fell to the ground." On the ground, the officer continued groping Gina, putting his hands all over her and describing how he kept touching her all over her body as she yelled for him to stop with no avail. When he finally let her go, he began, quote, acting like it wasn't a thing. He then accused her of being too drunk and telling her that she didn't know what she was talking about. But he would do her a favor by not arresting her. Gina points out that while she was, quote, tipsy, she was coherent enough to know what was going on and that she was being assaulted. Unsure of what to do, Gina left the bar. A few weeks later, Gina saw the officer again, and she tried to ignore him. But he approached her asking, quote, "Weren't you out here a couple of weeks ago showing your ass and stuff?" Angry at how he described the assault, Gina confronted him, replying, "Yeah, but wasn't you grabbing all over my ass?" But this time the officer wasn't alone. He was with his partner, who appeared confused by the verbal exchange. The officer who groped Gina tried to downplay the accusation, pulling her aside, saying, "You know how we get these people out here." Turning back to Gina, he says, "But we don't have to have any problems. I'll make sure I check out for you next time if there's ever something, and make sure I look out for you," offering her protection in exchange for her silence. Gina disclosed the assault to a friend who pushes her to report. But Gina feels uncomfortable reporting and wants to move past it, saying, "I didn't say anything because I was just like, whatever. Sometimes you just let men be men kind of thing, that situation." But she pauses and never finishes her sentence. When I asked Gina how she coped with officers harassing and assaulting her, she responds, "I didn't. I think it was just one of those things you just don't even think about it in the moment, and so you keep pushing." She concludes boys will be boys, and she has no faith in police. More of the department, quote, "ain't going to do nothing about him anyway. They just be like, okay, one person said something." Reflecting on why she and other Black women don't report gender-based and sexual violence from police, she says, "I think that's a lot of time what happens is we just want it to be over. We don't want any problems, so we don't allow reports to be made or extra work to make a statement, because a lot of times we are just trying to get on to the next." Despite claiming that she wants to just move on, Gina sometimes wishes she had reported the assault. She wonders if she could have helped the next Black woman he did this to, because it would have been one of those situations to where I didn't bring it up to say, at least, because then establish a pattern of it. Ultimately, for Gina, reporting still doesn't make sense because he's just going to be out there anyway. The fourth area in our survey, sexual coercion and assault, which includes whether an officer has ever, quote, "told you you would never receive a ticket or citation if you comply to an unwanted sexual act," captures Gina's and other Black women's I interviewed experiences. And I also want to point out that a critical aspect of Gina's story is that interpersonal violence was a critical aspect of how she came into contact with police in the first place and in her other encounters. And Black feminist researchers have pointed to domestic and familial violences like this, explaining how neglect can turn into criminalization, can turn into sexual violence, all within one encounter, stating how the denial of protection is also a form of police violence that increases vulnerability to other forms of violence. Ultimately, we believe that a community-engaged or specific population-engaged methods are best suited for addressing experiences that have been rendered invisible in our data. Understanding that the same processes that render these experiences invisible in the media are the same structures that shape vulnerabilities to violence. Ultimately, we think that policies aiming to address violence in the community should be critical of claims about groups who are not included in conceptualizations of measures of inequality and violence. In many ways, Black women are not the dominant reference group when we think about police violence, and their experiences aren't captured in operationalization measures used in policies and databases. Yet claims are made about their risks from these sources, and policies, particularly police reforms, are constructed around these claims. For example, in my data, I found that community policing models, which have mixed results in terms of lethal violence, made Black women vulnerable to police gender-based and sexual violence and underreporting, as officers knew where they stayed and their daily routines. Reporting in this environment where they knew these harms were not taken seriously meant that they were persistently vulnerable to gender-based and sexual violence, as well as retaliation from community police officers. Second, we argue that if groups are included in these claims, their lived experiences should be centered. In conceptualizing violence in the context of how experiences of violence from officers, this includes then thinking about police contacts in homes, in schools, and other locations that Black women talked about, malls, the airport, any place where officers were present. This also includes the various ways officers can draw on their power to inflict these harms when they're on and off duty. Next, we argued that we should include and explore the heterogeneity amongst marginalized populations to capture the breadth and scope of police violence and other violences, as I found that punishment and violence were rendered invisible through discourses of pathology and privilege, both of which can be used to obscure experiences of violence in Black women's lives. And in conclusion, I want to end with a quote by a Black feminist activist in her 30s who I interviewed talking about the survey. "I'm quite sure that women have interactions with police, especially interactions where police put their hands on them. There are many women who can report sexual violence, but we don't. Then domestic violence among police officers is high, but who are you going to call if the police officer is beating you, right? Police violence against Black women is probably, if you were to count the study and to count those numbers altogether, police violence against Black women Whether it's a domestic situation or just in a public space, you got to count those incidents. Black women are probably experiencing horrible, terrifying rates of police violence, but that's not counted. Ultimately, we argue that if we want to build a better world or abolish police, that world should and must include Black women. Not Black women as caregivers in service to other people's protection or other people's right to safety, but Black women as full human beings entitled to safety for themselves. And that means seeing and addressing their lived experiences with police. And thus, we argue that an iterative mixed methodological approach that calibrates measures based on how impacted populations describe their lived experiences is uniquely suited for challenging invisibility in the data or documenting violence and inequality on the margins. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. And then we have Rod Martinez, a senior associate at the Annie E. Casey Foundation.
All right, I'm also going to put the timer on my phone. Good morning, everyone. So today I'm going to talk about some work that I actually did while I was at the Urban Institute. As of a year ago, I transitioned career paths a little bit, and so I'm now at the Annie Casey Foundation, and I'm going to talk about some of my ongoing investment portfolios there. But I'm actually going to spend most of my time talking about a study I did at the Urban Institute with some really wonderful colleagues. But before then, just want to shout out John. Where's John? Is he gone? Okay. Well, so John was actually, we crossed paths while at the Urban Institute in the middle of this study, and he was a huge source of support. This study required a lot of time, a lot of effort, and had a lot of feelings involved. So John was a big source of support for this study. So the title of my talk is going to be Using PAR to Inform Reform Policy and Practice as it relates to the anti-violence workforce. So specifically, I'm going to be talking about a group of folks called credible messengers. And so, animation. Okay, so what is a credible messenger? So a few years ago, President Joe Biden actually mentioned credible messengers, and there's a wide growing interest across U.S. cities talking about credible messengers. So credible messengers are people who work with young people, work with young adults, other adults, in an effort to essentially keep them away from systems and also prevent harm, right? So they do a lot of de-escalation, a lot of harm mitigation. And so one of the big aspects of this project that we wanted to tackle was some clarity around what a credible messenger is. It seemed like everybody was using that credible messenger when we actually surveyed a bunch of organizations in New York City about, what is a credible messenger? There was everything from these are uncles, these are family, these are violence interrupters, but we wanted clarity on this definition specifically. And so this is a definition that we came up with of what a credible messenger is. So a credible messenger is typically someone who has had contact with the criminal legal system. Someone who's had contact with the criminal legal system or indirect contact. That's something that we also learned, that folks also think of people who have not had direct contact themselves, but maybe are family members, had a close friend who's had contact with the legal system. Also people who live in communities that have been criminalized en masse, right? But that's not enough, right? People also talked about the need for these individuals to have transformed their lives, to become community agents of change. Credibility from the community is really important. A lot of times people define credible messengers for their system involvement or contact, but what folks express to us is that that's not what makes us credible messengers. The people, the communities that we serve make us credible, right? And then, people also talked about credible messengers as having some of these soft skills around communication, good listening skills, empathy, and really a deep commitment for community transformation. And I want to read this quote because this is actually how we start the report. We say credible messengers are a bridge between reformists and abolitionists, and they represent an opportunity to vastly reduce our over-reliance on the institutions of policing and other carceral institutions. They also present New York City and other U.S. cities an opportunity to live up to their ideals of justice and remedy some of the injustices of the criminal justice system by centering people most directly impacted in the work of community restoration and healing. And so what I'm actually going to be spending the rest of the time on is a little bit of the background, what our charge was, the methods that we use, a little bit on findings, but then most of the talk is going to be on the recommendations that we put forward. And if I have time, I want to talk a little bit about some of the stuff, the really great projects that we have going on at the Annie Casey Foundation. Okay, so first, as now being in a funder role, I would be remiss to not thank our funders for this study. So we were funded by the New York City Mayor's Office of Economic Development, as well as the Young Men's Initiative. And so the purpose of this study was to understand the current evidence base for the use of credible messengers. So really understanding the efficacy of this workforce. And so to our knowledge and what we found is that there's really not a lot of studies out there looking at credible messengers, particularly whether or not they work, right? Which is the big question in the policy world. And so I think we found about 5 studies that had empirically looked at credible messengers. We also wanted to understand where credible messengers come from, right? What are the historical origins of this workforce? A lot of it can be traced to Eddie Ellis, who was a formerly incarcerated Black Panther from Harlem, who started this work with a group of other incarcerated men at a New York State prison. Or at least, that's where most people agree that a lot of the origins are. And then, we wanted to conduct a landscape study to really understand we wanted to be as close to a census to get an understanding of every organization, CBO, every agency, every department that had credible messengers in New York City. And so our goal was to be as inclusive as possible in that. And so we made contact with, I think somewhere over about 30 organizations. But again, I can talk about it later, but it's kind of hard to track some of the work going on. And so specifically what we did was, of course, a literature review. Won't spend a lot of time talking about that. And we enacted a community engaged methods framework as well as a participatory action research framework, which I'll talk about in a second. And then a cross-program study. We weren't looking at just one program. We wanted to understand the workforce in general in New York City. And then, the last bit of what we did was, of course, dissemination. We wanted this to be public. We wanted to give clarity to the field of practitioners, of policymakers on what this workforce actually does and their perceived impact in New York City. All right. So we employed 2 different types of community engaged methods. One was much more broad in the sense that we engaged key stakeholders from New York City throughout the project. So this included people from the mayor's office, academics, other experts in the field of credible messengers themselves, people who had been served by credible messengers, and we organized them a couple of times throughout the 2-year study so they can provide input in as many things as possible, including our instruments, what we were doing, and they were really essential. A few individuals actually gave us more feedback than others. And then, the biggest part of this project was hiring and training 4 credible messengers as research assistants at the Urban Institute. So at the time, this is actually the first participatory action research project in the history of the Justice Policy Center. So it was a lot of effort. John, you missed it earlier. I was thanking you for all of the support with something like that, and hopefully this doesn't die on me. And so, the way that we train the credible messengers is we develop trainings. We developed workshops for them. One of the extra deliverables that I was able to provide to my funders was actually a training manual on how to train credible messengers in research methods. I think it was like a 100-page document that basically gave them an overview of the Urban Institute, how we do research, timelines, budgets, everything they needed to know, including how to use Box. And so, what was really important to me, and I also realized I'm going to be repeating a lot of what Brooklyn was saying about the need to sustain this past the time of the project. I'm really happy to report that 3 out of the 4 credible messengers went on to do more nerdy research things after the conclusion of the project, including joining
Sorry about that. I don't want your computer to die.
I don't either. And so what was really important to me also was making sure that these messengers were embedded in the fabric of the Urban Institute, that they weren't just on one project, my project, but that they felt included in the entire organization. And so I was able to finesse professional development time from the Urban Institute and really embed them in staff meetings, to welcome them, but also to provide more opportunities to serve on other projects across the Urban Institute. And so for the actual study, what we did is 3 in-depth organizational case studies of credible messenger organizations in New York City, including Community Connections for Youth. We also surveyed 30 organizational leaders and coordinators across agencies and organizations that employed credible messengers, and then 17 interviews with city officials, stakeholders, including, again, academics, researchers who are in this area. And the content of a lot of the questions and what we were asking about was, some clarity around the term credible messenger and lived experience, the goals and services that they provide, recruitment qualifications, training, perceived impact, challenges, collaboration, and communication. So a few important things that came up. So again, it's really important that we think about, oftentimes people like the idea of credible messengers, but they don't like to think of them as a real workforce that need, good paying jobs and support. And so, we really wanted to understand all of those things. And so, we asked about recruitment and qualifications, including, how do you hire credible messengers? Where do you find them? How do you create a job ad for a credible messenger? It's really awkward to say you want people with criminal convictions, right, for a job. And so, we were really digging into what community credibility meant, what lived experience meant. One of the debates in New York City and something that's ongoing in the field is whether or not there should be, whether or not credible messengers should be professionally trained before they actually, are in the field, so to speak, right? So we actually found that was not the case. A lot of people actually went against that and said that we're not social workers, we're not clinicians, and that's what we don't want to be doing here. And so we actually were able to inform a lot of the discourse in New York City around that. We also talked about, the need for, professional development is important, but it should be on the job. Their perceived impact across a lot of organizations and people, right, was that they provide individual and community-wide healing, empowerment, and capacity building. They are often connections between communities, systems, and policymakers. They help us rethink our ideas around public safety, and they bring awareness to systemic and societal forms of oppression. Perceived challenges, obviously the mark of a criminal record is deeply stigmatizing, even in those work environments. Systemic racism, these are mostly Black and Latino men and women, and then capitalism. Low pay and lack of benefits is not something new. Virtually everyone who's done work on credible messengers or violence interrupters will repeat the same thing. There's some funding barriers, workplace challenges, and trauma. All right, so some recommendations is that we increase credible messengers' pay and benefits and supports. In many cases, credible messengers act as first responders and they're not paid like them. And so that's one of our first recommendations. We also think that there's a need to provide professional development opportunities to improve the way that they work. One of the interesting things that we also find is that they also recommended to us that people with lived experience in the criminal justice system be hired in all roles and fields. A lot of folks were actually tired of being pigeonholed into, if that's a word, into criminal justice. A lot of folks didn't want to do that. And they're constantly being pushed into credible messenger work, but that's not what they wanted to do. And so the other thing is, this is more, a couple of these are more for funders, right? To increase the investments in credible messenger-led organizations versus those more corporate giants that exist in New York City and across the country, and, especially community-based organizations that are really embedded in those in communities that they serve. There was some fair amount of collaboration between city agencies and communities, but we recommend, of course, the need for more partners at the table. for funders to allow funding to be used flexibly for capacity building between organizations. So, oftentimes these organizations wanted to do professional development, but they couldn't because of funder restrictions or the scopes of work that they had developed. This third one is very specific to New York City. So it took way too long to execute contracts with the city. And this was even a problem for us. And thankfully, the Urban Institute being this giant, we were able to bear the brunt of not being paid so late. But community-based organizations, they couldn't take that burden on of like not being paid on time, right? So the process is slow. I did hear back from our funder, and this process is improving in part because of this. And we also gave them some shit at the Urban Institute. So a couple of other things. This is for the researchers. So one of the things that kept coming up was that there's a need to introduce alternate and healing-based forms of evaluation and performance measurement. Folks are really tired of recidivism and levels of violence. And they also talked about the need for more qualitative work here because you can't possibly capture the amount of labor that goes into this kind of work. Folks are responding at all hours of the night. And so there was a need for researchers to be able to capture that and the complexities of that. And introduce, again, healing has become a big word, but folks are not measuring that. How do you measure that? What is that? We need to do more work there. And then, the last thing is that we ensure that the process of the work drives the structures and processes. And so what that means is that increasingly as more people adopt this as an alternative response or whatever have you, this is becoming diluted. And that there was a real interest in essentially continuing the legacy of Eddie Ellis, the formerly incarcerated Black Panther, and understand that this is a program and philosophy rooted in restorative and transformative justice, not to be diluted, because again, this has turned into McDonald's in many ways in this in the context where everyone's trying to reimagine public safety, but we need to remember the ideals of the actual Credible Messenger program. All right, so I think that's all the time I have, but I'm sure we'll talk more with Steve's panel, but thank you all.
Wonderful. Okay, and our final panelist is Sophia Block, an undergraduate research scholar at the Justice Policy Lab at the Watson Institute here at Brown University.
Hello. First of all, I would like to thank Dr. John Eason for allowing me to speak today. As mentioned, my name is Sophia Block. I am a senior graduating in May from Brown, double concentrating in sociology as well as international and public affairs. The presentation that I'm going to give today, conducted under Dr. John Eason and his team of researchers, builds upon the presentation that was given yesterday by Sam and Sarah. On the case studies of prison closures in Blythe and Susanville, California. But my presentation today will build upon this and give a renewed attention to the community-engaged methods that we used in the research process. So to give a brief overview of what I'm going to cover today, first I will start on a bit of background on prison towns, followed by some personal reflections on community-engaged research, a bit on reframing prison abolition itself, and then I'll get into the research purpose, design findings, and then some takeaways that I hope you will all get from this presentation today. So to begin with, as we know, prison towns are often built on invisible land in rural areas. 1 in 4 rural Americans live in a prison town, and the prison boom has gone largely unnoticed as most were built in low-income rural communities of color. So in these rural low-income communities of color, there's a large economic dependence and reliance on prisons in the community. So when these prisons close, there's a lot of community hesitation and fear of economic decline, which leads a lot of residents in these areas to fear for the prosperity of their communities following the prison closures. So before I get into the research design methods and findings, I wanted to talk about positionality and reflexivity, as this was a vital part of our strategy moving forward. in working with residents of prison towns that were about to experience or have experienced a prison closure. So students over the past 3 semesters worked in collaboration with city councils and mayors in prison towns in rural California. We had to approach this with an openness to learning and understanding of lived experiences. With this comes along an acknowledgement of power differentials. Students and researchers over the past 3 semesters, we are all students of Brown University, an elite university, speaking with rural communities in California that many of us, including myself, have never been to. I've never been to Blythe or Susanville, which are the case studies for today. Also, we were working with communities of different ideologies. Many student researchers, including myself, identify as abolitionists, prison abolitionists, whereas local governments and community members in Blythe and Susanville approached our research project opposing the prison closure. So as researchers, we have to think, how can we really reconcile the differing research purposes between ourselves, the researchers, and the communities that we're working alongside with? And the solution to this was focusing on curbing prison demand. So while we as researchers want to find economic, sustainable alternatives to prison closures, a lot of people in these communities wanted to utilize our research to propel the movement forward to keep their prisons open rather than focusing on what to do in the face of a prison closure. So my background is on studying wrongful convictions within the criminal legal system under Professor Nicole Gonzalez-Van Cleef, who's sitting over there. So a lot of my research focuses on decarceration and racial inequality in criminalization and incarceration. But for this project, which was outside of my area of expertise, there was a renewed focus on decarceration efforts with attention to the communities that would be most impacted in rural areas. So this was a really big switch that I had to personally examine and thoroughly reflect on in the research process, because in my research, I focus on the criminalization of disability and specifically racism and ableism in policing. So for me to switch from analyzing inequality within the prison system to analyzing inequality within rural America because of prison closures was a big shift that I just wanted to acknowledge in this presentation. And for this work, we really wanted to focus on centering intersectionality of identities. Again, as many people who we spoke to in these prison towns are rural, low-income communities of color, we wanted to focus on their lived experiences and joint collaboration for the betterment of community between ourselves, the researchers, those impacted by the prison closures, and then their local governmental systems. And I wanted to briefly mention how we should reframe prison abolition. So I believe that we cannot advocate for prison closures without considering policy implications and outcomes for prison towns that are primarily lower income communities of color in rural areas. So therefore, we need to reframe prison abolition as a policy and practice, not solely theory. This is not to say that theory is not important, as it is the building blocks of everything I'm going to discuss today, but really just to advance the idea that we need to have a renewed attention to policy and practice and thinking logically about the consequences of prison closures, not merely advocating for prison closures by itself. And I wanted to acknowledge a top-down versus bottom-up approach to policy, meaning that from a top-down perspective, states can decarcerate responsibly. They should decarcerate responsibly, but I'll get into how in these rural towns in California, a lot of residents feel as though the decarceration process was not responsible and without community input. But governments should anticipate consequences and attempt to mitigate these consequences of prison closures through policy. And from a bottom-up approach, communities can advocate for curbing prison demand by offering prison alternatives. And this is where we came in to work with towns in rural California to say, okay, your prisons are closing. What do you want to better your community and economically sustain your community because of your economic reliance on the prisons? And through the bottom-up approach, we aim to center community voices proactively in decision-making processes and development strategies and ensure community representation and engagement in decision-making spaces. So our purpose, as I sort of alluded to earlier, we wanted to find prison alternatives and curb prison demand in former prison towns to address the impact of closures through centering community voices and utilizing community-engaged approaches. So our case study sites, I know that Sam and Sarah spoke about this yesterday. We spoke with residents of Susanville and Blythe, California. Susanville, their prison closed in June of 2023, and a lot of their residents were fearing economic decline because of their reliance on the prison. And Blythe, California, their prison is supposed to close in March of 2025, and I know a lot of their residents have a lot of pushback against this idea. So we were working with Blythe to really come up with what are some viable alternatives that can sustain Blythe's economy, given that so many people in Blythe work in the prison system and have economic reliance on the prison system. So for our research design, it was mostly a lot of student researchers who worked on this project over the past 3 semesters, and this project is ongoing. We utilized a mixed methods approach. I'll mainly focus on the qualitative aspect of this, but I wanted to acknowledge that there is simultaneously, along with this community-engaged research, qualitative data, there is a quantitative team that is working to analyze how prison closures impact 7 variables in census data, including the population, percent of supplemental security income recipients, food insecurity, Medicaid beneficiaries, poverty rate, unemployment, and total impoverishment rate. But again, I'm going to focus on the community engaged portion of this. So we were going to meet with community members in former and future prison towns to understand the town's deep and complex history and reliance on the prison through semi-structured interviews. And through this, it was important that we, as students, as researchers of products of Brown University, treat Blythe and Susanville as unique towns with different and specialized wants and needs. So we did not want to generalize what Susanville wanted to Blythe or vice versa. We wanted to acknowledge each prison town as its own entity and really listen to community members and what they wanted to see transform in their town following the prison closures. And then in terms of our dissemination approach, we were going to present findings to governmental bodies, including the city council and the mayor in Blythe and Susanville. And this was open to community members. We really wanted to ensure that in our dissemination process, community members felt as though their voices were heard and as though we were amplifying their voices, not pushing any sort of external agenda. We were merely meeting with them and synthesizing their ideas for their town moving forward. And we wanted to make sure that they had access to these disseminated results. So in terms of qualitative findings, interviewees from Blythe and Susanville both emphasized the fear that prison closures will be associated with decline in businesses, local schools, and etc. In terms of social movements, we found that in talking with residents of Blythe and Susanville, in both prison towns, there were oppositional movements to the prison closure. In Susanville, there was the Save CCC campaign, which is the California Correctional Center, and in Blythe, there was the Save Chuckawalla Valley State Prison campaign. So, as we can see, it was very difficult to reconcile how we as researchers were feeling about the prison closures and how that would ameliorate inequality within prisons with how these rural communities of color were dealing with the prison closure and how it would impact their daily life. So these oppositional movements spurred because of that. And in terms of responsible decarceration efforts, community members felt as though they didn't have a say in the closure decision or the process. So a lot of them felt as though they were blindsided and that reactions to the prison closure should have been proactive, but instead were reactionary. And I wanted to briefly read this quote that illustrates how community members felt as though the prison closure warranted a reactionary response rather than proactive measures. And they felt as though the government completely blindsided them and was not responsibly decarcerating from a top-down perspective. So this is from a business owner and educator, a resident of Blythe for over 45 years. The overarching issue is and continues to be the fact that we are reacting to this rather than having the opportunity from the beginning to be proactive with regard to the decisions being made. And I think that's a complete injustice to our community and to the prison system, to, the employees and even the inmates. I mean, they have rights too, and they have families too, and they have, limited resources just like this town does. And I think that having that carpet pulled out from under them, I think that being reactive instead of having the opportunity to be proactive from the beginning was not good. With that being said, with acknowledging that people in the town were not happy about the prison closures, I wanted to also acknowledge a false dichotomy. So what abolitionists know in the abolitionist space is that there are racial inequalities within prison. Obviously, we know this. And what abolitionists are currently learning is how prison closures can exacerbate inequality for rural towns. What I offer to this conversation is an acknowledgement that we have to work towards ameliorating inequality inside and outside of prisons simultaneously. You can't have one without the other. And in Blythe, I wanted to go over some of our preliminary findings. We wanted to amplify community members' perspectives as experts in the well-being of their own town. So in asking them about repurposing the prison, solutions were offered such as warehouses, renewable energy centers, data centers, and in terms of alternative development strategies, they alluded to investing in natural resources and tourism, investing in public health, renewable energy, utilizing the airport. And as some key takeaways from this presentation, I just wanted to ensure that I've added something to the conversation in abolitionist spaces. As states shift towards decarceration efforts, we need to be mindful of how rural communities can be effective leaders in curbing prison demand. We need to imagine the potential in rural communities of color and acknowledge our relative power as researchers as we embark on research processes in collaboration with these rural communities. We know that systems of racialized violence and state control exacerbate racial inequality in prisons, and while attempting to mitigate this racial inequality within prisons, states often exacerbate rural inequality. However, we can ameliorate inequality inside and outside of prisons simultaneously through responsible decarceration efforts and community input in curbing prison demand. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, wonderful. This was a really exciting panel. I've learned so much. So I want to start by zooming out and thinking a little bit about methods first before zooming back into the panel. So this is a really exciting time for new methods, or not always new methods, but methods that have been around a while but are starting to really infiltrate into criminology and punishment society, and basically become increasingly mainstream. So just a couple of examples of some exciting things happening kind of in the fields that I'm in. We're seeing the rise of poetry as method. So I don't see, where's Monica Bell? Monica Bell is doing empirical poetry. A colleague at Delaware, Santhi Leone, is doing I poetry or I poems. We're seeing the incorporation of authors writing fiction as part of their research products. Incorporating fiction based on their research, like Fergus McNeill. We're seeing the increasing incorporation of first person and lived experience, again in the publication, as with Reuben Miller, which I don't also see, but I can't see very well, my eyesight and all that. I'm seeing more people drawing on creative confabulation from Saidiya Hartman. Photo voice with Susila, Susila Gurusamy is using. Something I'm not seeing as much of, but there's a lot of resonance to a lot of these methods, and what we're hearing today is also indigenous methods, or depending on your preference, First Nations, Native peoples, such as the work by Linda Smith and others working in decolonizing methods, again with a lot of parallels to what we're hearing. So I wanted to think a little bit about some of the there are plenty of benefits. I'm going to skip over the benefits, but also just I'm going to talk about both the benefits and the limitations of using new methods, and just kind of think about this a little practically and kind of big picture again. So traditionally, when we're focusing on what methods we use, we often focus on a couple of priorities, but one kind of the most central one traditionally that we focus on is essentially for data collection, what's going to get us the best data on the target of our research question. That's usually the central thing. So we always say, pick the method that helps with your research question. But then kind of secondary traditional concerns are also what's available, what can I actually get access to, what's realistic. And then of course ethics, which is a huge branch of considerations of what's ethically doable, what should I do, when should I not do certain research. But increasingly, we're starting to focus more on other considerations that historically weren't forefront a lot of times in our minds, or at least in mainstream research. And so some of these considerations are things like, what what gets us access? That's something that traditionally ethnographers were better at doing, but I think this is also something that we're starting to think more seriously about. What lets us essentially collect and present data in ways that are essentially truer to the people that we're studying, our participants. What lets us kind of protect their voice and elevate their voice, and basically not dilute it or mess it up too much with our like sciencey approach. Also, increasingly, we're thinking about what's most effective for our audience. So whether we're talking about policymakers or voters or students or activists or the communities that we're studying as well. So what's actually going to speak most to these different groups, and those might be different answers. So sometimes we think about what's going to be the most powerful and evocative, and qualitative methods tends to be really good at this, like getting those stories where it's a gut punch to hear those. Or alternatively, we think about like what's most persuasive and legitimate. So especially for policy circles, this tends to be quantitative methods. Then, of course, there are career considerations. What can get published? Doing new methods is kind of difficult. Getting people to sign off on something that's not familiar is very challenging. And also what allows career advancement. There are different biases against different types of methods, and so that's also a consideration. And then another one that's kind of increasingly over the last 5 or so years is transparency on data publication. So, we're under increasing pressure, even for qualitative research, to publish our research, our data, not just our research, but our data in ways that also has considerations for the privacy of the folks that we're studying, and then can, in turn affect access issues and things like that. So these are some big picture things that I was kind of thinking about in the background. But I want to turn back to this to the panel and these wonderful talks. And Sophia kind of scooped me on a couple of the things that I was going to say, or some of the questions that I was going to ask. But I want to come back to the question of limitations, and kind of thinking about this both from the stance of yes, as social science, but also just practically thinking about this in terms of advice for future researchers who want to replicate these methods. Not replicate as in I want to replicate your findings, but I want to do this too. How do I do that? What are some considerations? So I want to ask the panelists, and feel free to answer or not answer, but just a couple of questions for the group. So what sorts of obstacles that you face? You've shown us these wonderful studies, so exciting, but I didn't hear so much about where did things go wrong? What are for somebody who wants to go out and do these things, what advice would you offer? What sort of obstacles did you run into, barriers did you run into, things that went wrong? So I'm especially interested, again, thinking about Monica Bell's research, for example. Thank you. Do you run into people who either on the one hand don't want to participate in your study? This is, always a consideration, but especially I'm curious for participatory action research. But especially, do you have people, especially with the team-based research where the community members are part of your research team, do you run into issues where people need anonymity, or it's actually dangerous for them to participate in your research? Or they, you want to give them credit, but you can't because, it would somehow put them at greater risk, if they're on parole, if you have people who are currently incarcerated, or if you have people who are dealing with police violence. What sorts of obstacles do you run into to even just getting people to participate, and how to do it in a way that respects their dignity, their autonomy, their safety, and all that, while also, abiding by IRB and all of those things. I was also thinking about what are some of the obstacles we can think about as a field for when people want to scale up and do this, more people are going to do this. And one of the things I worry about when methods go mainstream is they do get diluted. They do get, people are not always as thoughtful about doing this work. And so what are some of the things that, you can anticipate? And related to that, I was going to ask about positionality, and what are some of the issues that come up. So when you're studying people who are of a different class, race, background, or history or status, people who have different preferences, different politics than you, and thinking about the power dynamics at play. So I like how participatory action research has the potential, as Dr. Hitchens was saying, to reduce some of those extractive natures of research, But at the same time, like they're still there, and it's also going to look different in different communities and with different researchers. And so, kind of thinking about those sorts of issues. And then, sorry, I'm just trying to read my notes here. Oh, right. And then another question that I've actually been kind of thinking about, thank you, with the last couple of days is, or not a couple of days, yesterday and today, is, and Sophia, you brought this up in your study. What happens when you go into the field and you have different goals than your participants? And this is something that I think we sometimes see with like even things like defund the police or abolish prisons in communities where you go in expecting people to be on the same page, but actually it's more complicated than that. That's not necessarily what people want. And so kind of thinking about, what, again, kind of thinking about obstacles, what happens when what you expect to find is not what you find, or what you expect people to think is not what you think, and how to adjust in a way that's, true to one, the data, and two, to what your participants want. Sometimes in ways that are kind of uncomfortable, and sometimes in ways that are like, oh, wow, that really makes me think. Like, that's really interesting. So I'm going to go ahead and stop there. And either you guys can respond, or you can just turn to questions. It's totally up to you.
I can respond. What I'll say as a challenge is, I won't just attribute this to the Urban Institute or any of the other organizations I've been a part of, but there's a really basic challenge around like putting formerly incarcerated people with system contact in white collar work environments. I haven't quite articulated what that cultural piece is, but there is, and I say that as a first generation professional as well, like it takes years and years to learn. Some of you have talked about the hidden curriculum, learn how to handle yourself professionally in like the non-white supremacist way, right? Like just, a lot of really basic things, like how to organize your work in this environment where you're not being like supervised so closely, right? Like white collar work environments are. And so, I've had that now working with some of our grantees who place system impacted young people in these professional opportunities, which is really great. But sometimes they run into challenges around like, well, they're not showing up to meetings. It must mean that they don't care. And I'm like, no, they have a lot of stuff going on. And on top of it, it takes a while to understand that not everybody lives their life through Outlook. And so it just, but people get really frustrated and sometimes very upset because they take it personally that these young people aren't, on top of, right, young folks have a different idea of work these days, but, and so, that becomes a huge challenge. And I think it's a tension, right? Also expose them to people who come from different racial groups, different class backgrounds is also, and I could talk about a bunch of stories related to that, but yeah, I think that's a big issue. But something that I brought up to John's students a few weeks ago was also you need to understand your institution's policies around different things because it varies. The challenges can vary according to institution. For example, me and my co-PI were actually freaking out about hiring people with criminal convictions. We're like, oh, the Urban Institute is going to have all types of stuff to say and barriers, and it turns out they don't have educational requirements to apply to the Urban Institute. And I was like, wow, that wasn't even a problem, right? But you really have to understand your institution's policies.
Okay, I can go next. There are a ton of obstacles, right? There are a ton. The big one is funding, right? So how I view funding now as a tenure track professor is different than how I viewed it as a graduate student. And so I think it's important to recognize that the funding will look different at different stages in your career. And I think that scaling up as a field requires us to be intentional about where we are in our career, right? So how I look at funding or scaling up PAR looks differently now. Now I have, a little bit more access to money and things of that nature than I did when I was a graduate student. Other obstacles, it's a very tenuous relationship when you're working with community-based orgs and nonprofits, right? So any small thing, given the legacy of mistrust of universities and research more generally, any small thing can ruin the relationship, right? And I've seen that firsthand. Like a small HR issue that someone might see as benign, right, can literally ruin your access to a population. And so, thinking about that on the front end, but also getting everyone that you're working with on code about how things should go or not go in the community is important. And to be honest with you, as it relates to positionality, I think sometimes if you're working with a community that knows you, or you're the same racial ethnic group as those folks, it's sometimes harder, right? Because the standards are higher. They're expecting you to come into their community with a level of fidelity and all the things. So I would argue that sometimes our work is actually harder. Anonymity, we ask folks, right, whether they want to use pseudonyms. And surprisingly, a lot of people don't want to use them. They want their voices to be heard. They want their names to be in the books. They want people to hear their voices. Interestingly, you have to double check that too, because sometimes once you see the product, you might not be happy with it, or you might want something changed. So I think it's important to keep that line of communication open with your participants. And then the extractive nature. I think we try to be really upfront with folks. The reality is this: as academics, we will get more out of this than the people that we often study, right? And I think that's an uncomfortable truth, but it's true. And I think we need to be honest about that with our participants and do our due diligence to make sure we're getting the funding and we're funneling it to the people that need it, giving them the resources so that they can be upwardly mobile, but being real about the ways in which we will benefit from it. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, and I was going to say two things. One, in terms of obstacles, particularly in terms of my project, the obstacles came more from academia, especially at the beginning of the project. So I think when you're investigating marginalized topics or invisible experiences, and particularly if you're a graduate student doing that versus a faculty member, those come from the gatekeepers from within. And for me, within my project, it was like, if the experience is invisible, there wasn't a lot of reflexivity around then how now am I oppressing the knowledge production around that experience. So saying questions like, well, Black women don't experience police violence because we don't have any reports on it, which one isn't true, but two, that's part of the question and the process, or making assumptions about Black middle-class women's experiences of police or other types of violences. So I think in terms of for junior scholars particularly, I think for me, finding a group of people who were supportive of that work, who had a politics that I shared, whether they were inside the academy or not, or other institutions. I'm looking out at a bunch of people here who have been like super important to my process. It was really important for when you go in there and people basically do the process of making it invisible on you as you're trying to do that type of work. And then in terms of positionality, I think just bluntly, we aren't entitled to people's stories. So a no is a no, and that's okay. I don't think a no means sometimes we need to figure out how to get at the story. I think it just means we respect the no, and they will share their story with whom they want to, and then we have to figure out what we want to do next. And so I think for me, in terms of my positionality, I don't know if I would have been able to do my project if I also didn't identify or wasn't a Black woman. Because I had participants stay in their car and wait till the researcher showed up and was like, I'm waiting for you. Or I wouldn't have talked to someone about this experience because they wouldn't have understood. And I think, again, instead of seeing that as like a schism in the research process and more of like histories and legacies of epistemic violence, I think it just means some people are better suited based on their position. We always term me-search, I think particularly for scholars of color, as like a negative, when actually it's a resource when we come from those communities and share those experiences.
And I'll also add to the conversation just by saying for the research that I was a part of, I was a team of 20 or so student researchers coming from all different places, all different backgrounds and phases of life, and speaking with rural communities of color in California. It was just something that we were constantly thinking about, our positionality and reflexivity in the research process. And we did have a standardized set of questions in our semi-structured interview protocol, and I think that really helped in analyzing our positionality, but also trying to standardize what we were trying to learn from participants. And I'll also say that in the research process and reaching out to community members, we had sometimes like a 10% response rate, and that's just what it is, and that's okay. Some people would love their stories to be heard, others want to be anonymized, others don't want to share their stories, and that's completely okay. But with that, we have to acknowledge that the people who are willing to speak with us and want their stories told may not be representative of all of the community members. A lot of people who we spoke with in Susanville and Blythe were very, very opposed to the prison closure, and that may be reflective of the community at large, but that was definitely reflective of the small sample size that we had, which was another variable, the very, very small sample size that I hope was indicative of the community that we were trying to represent.
Okay, so we have time for 2 questions, so why don't we go ahead and take 2, or,
Actually,
okay.
I'm gonna hop in because we have questions online. They were coming in real slow yesterday, so we actually have some online. So the folks here can probably catch you guys during the break. We're gonna take in a couple of minutes. But from online, we have for Brooklyn, what's the parameters of quote-unquote success you use? Were and how those parameters, how and what were the parameters, and how were those parameters determined, right? What were they and how were they determined for success? Then for Rod, was there peer-to-peer credible messenger training? Meaning did the folks with actual lived experience train folks since their experts, their expertise is invaluable? Should probably put on my reading glasses. Sorry about that. Any advice, and then for Brooklyn again, there was any advice on how university collaborations can foster more CEM participatory research, given the IRB challenges and everything else, right? And lastly, for Sophia, can you talk a little more about your experience transitioning from, or I think that other question wasn't for Brooklyn, that may have been for you, Shannon.
Oh.
And I think you sort of addressed some of it
Can
already,
you
but
repeat?
yeah. Sorry about that. You were like, this isn't. My bad. Any advice, I think you spoke to this a little bit, but you can speak to it a little bit more. Any advice on how university collaborations can foster more community engaged participatory research, given IRB challenges and everything else? You spoke to this a little bit, but you can speak on it a little bit more. And lastly, for Sophia, can you talk a little more about your experience transitioning from disability inequality to decarceration? Like, I think they're thinking about your positionality in particular. So, thank you all. And you all have a minute each to answer these questions. Is that cool? In no particular order, whoever wants to go first can go.
I'll be quick because I'll take less than a minute because I love questions. Parameters of success. So success is ongoing, right? It's an iterative process. I think we look at success at different levels. So we look at the actual PAR team. To what extent are we helping folks transition after the PAR project into upward mobility? So are we enrolling them in school? Are they able to then get a job? Maybe if they don't want to work in the credible messenger model after PAR, are they able to move into another type of job that they value, right? Are we publishing with them, right? That part is a really strong marker of success, and we have a pretty good track record of that. As it relates to data collection, success in data collection, I mean, that's iterative as well. We pride ourselves on getting these large samples of folks who otherwise wouldn't be involved in research at all. And so we look at that from each step. So are we able to get folks to come out and line up to take the survey or to sit for an interview? And then the fallout steps, of collaborating, of analyzing, and then publishing. So long story short, we spend a lot of time in the communities that we serve, and that has benefits as well. And we see that as a measure of success because people want us to be there, right? So I think that matters as well. I'll stop there.
Yeah, I'll talk about, I think, collaboration IRB challenges. I think one of the things when I think about the IRB in terms of like protecting human subjects, I think it's the priority really is protecting the institution from liability. And so I think in terms of some of those challenges, talking about any experience of violence, the institution is more invested in how, if any blowback comes from this, how will that impact us as an institution? But I'm going to center the question a little bit on safety. And so I think in terms of thinking about safety for participants, not relying on the IRB, actually I think is super important to dictate your practices of safety, actually relying on the community, relying on the Black women. And that was different for each Black woman. Again, there's some blanket things in terms of anonymity, using pseudonyms. But for some of them, particularly those who had closer contact with police, or ongoing contact with police, we had conversations about what they needed in terms of to feel safe, not only after publication, but also during the interview. So I think I think a lot of things we're trying to figure out, but explicitly asking people how they would want to approach it, I think is just really important.
So, yeah, the answer is yes. There is mutual training going on at all times with credible messengers, training other credible messengers. The Credible Messenger Justice Center in New York City is probably the most well known, where that's led by credible messengers who train other credible messengers in the philosophy and teachings of the approach.
And I'll say in regard to my question, over the last year, I've pursued an independent research project for my senior thesis on the intersection of racism and ableism in the carceral state and in policing specifically. So I interviewed parents of children who have been diagnosed with so-called invisible disabilities such as ADHD and autism. And in asking these parents, I really want to understand, how do they prepare their children to interact with police, and does this vary by race of the parent or of the child? So in looking at that, that is really my background as a researcher. I have a strong background in wrongful convictions. I worked for the Innocence Project. So coming into this space and focusing on decarceration kind of seemed like the next natural step. With this being said, I have a lot easier of a time sympathizing with decarceration for those who are incarcerated than rural communities that are affected by decarceration. So it was a challenge for me to really see the other side of decarceration, which is an important perspective that must be heard and we must acknowledge. But again, this was new to me stepping into this research position, just in valuing different perspectives and acknowledging that we can have both. We can responsibly decarcerate and curb prison demand while increasing inequality for those who are incarcerated, while decreasing inequality for those who are incarcerated, as well as decreasing equality for those who are impacted in rural communities. So it was a bit of a challenge for me transitioning, but I'd say that my background in disability studies and in acknowledging the system of racism and ableism that's woven into the fabric of our nation, it's really impactful and really sets the stage for me entering the decarceration space. So I'd say my background was an asset in that respect.
So I believe we're out of time, so please join me in thanking our fantastic panelists.
We'll do a quick 5-minute break, and then we'll power through for the last panel.
We did it.
Sophia? Happy birthday to Sarah. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Sarah. Happy birthday to you. Sadie, if you want to do it now, bring it. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. All right. Now we're going to make you wait for the cake. You get your cake with lunch. Okay. That was a lot of fun. That's a great icebreaker to make the final push here. More bad news with the weather. Those of you online can't see, but New England was terrible the last few days. I brought this up yesterday. I think we got a little bit of sun today. It looked like it peaked for a minute, but it was raining and storming and everything else. So Dr. Jontel White from the Shop Foundation will not make it, sadly, but we hope we can be in touch with her in the future. We do, however, have Steve Plank, the Vice President of Research, Evaluation, Evidence, and Data at the Annie Casey Foundation, and also Chloe Cockburn, CEO of Just Impact Advisors. They will both be speaking today, and I've asked them to give talks about what their work is on, what their major initiatives are, and any potential collaborative spaces that they have garnered from spending a day and a half with us. They are not used to, I think Chloe said yesterday, she hasn't been back to school in a while, and she feels more than well caught up right now. So thank everybody for hanging around this long, and I'm going to have Chloe come up first, and then we'll have Steve. So thank you guys for your attention.
And how do I click it? On the one on the right-hand side? Awesome. And this thing's on? Okay. Cool. Hi, everyone. It's been lovely to meet some of you over the past few days. My name's Chloe Coburn. It's from Scotland. Don't pronounce the middle. So yeah, it's been interesting to be here with you all. Actually, I'm going to start my timer so I know what's going on here. Hang on. Boom. And we're coming from a very different perspective in here, so it's been really fascinating to hear about all your research. And then what I'm going to try and do is just share a little bit about who I am and how I do the work in the land that I am in, which is social justice philanthropy, a particular corner of philanthropy, and then share some reflections and some ideas that might potentially be useful to you all. And then, of course, happy to answer questions or talk after, whatever's useful. So first, to introduce a little bit about me, I come from a family of journalists. These are all books by my family. There's my grandfather, who was a communist journalist in the 30s, 40s, 50s in Ireland and England. That's my mom, Leslie, writing about drug war in Colombia. This is my dad, Andrew Coburn, talking about military-industrial complex, and this is my uncle, Alexander Coburn, also talking about the drug war. So these are the sort of politics that I grew up in and is part of how I ended up here today. My dad's from Ireland. That's a picture that I took, and that sort of grounds a lot of my politics as well, colonial history, revolutionary politics. I'm a lawyer by training. That's a couple of the places that I've worked, a civil rights law firm, ACLU. I spent 6 years at Open Philanthropy. That's how I came into funding. This is a funding vehicle working with Dustin Moskovitz and Carrie Tuna. He's a co-founder of Facebook. So I came out of the ACLU and worked with them for 6 years to give away about $150 million for them, and then formed a lot of relationships with other donors, ended up spinning out in 2022. I got a grant from Open Phil and doing what's I'm now leading, which is Just Impact. So what I do now is 4 kind of categories of things: fund, advise, educate, strategize, like I'd like to say. So the fund is it's what we call an intermediary fund, where I raise money into the fund, C3 and C4 dollars, and then C4 is political money, and give that away to various different categories I'll go into in a minute, but a huge emphasis on organizing, campaigns, political work, power building work, big emphasis on funding directly impacted leadership. Not from an ethical position, but from a strategic position, because as I think, based on what I've heard in the past day and a half, people here recognize there's a lot of knowledge and strategic power in communities most impacted, and getting dollars to them really helps advance that work. I advise donors that come to me for advice on various questions. I also publish regular memos and a Substack. I'll have the link at the end in case that interests you, where I'm trying to sort of gather and synthesize ideas and push them out to people who might be listening to what I have to say. My main audience being other people in philanthropy. So I speak in a very opinionated way to them. That's not necessarily how I would speak in public, but to my colleagues in philanthropy, I'm trying to sort of, again, synthesize and shape ideas and give them a sense of at least where I and people in the field together with whom I'm thinking, where we think the work really is, and therefore, don't really stand up in front of people a lot, so I'm a little trembly, how we can most strategically fund that work. I spend a lot of time educating donors, and then I do spend some amount of time educating people who are seeking funds on how to go about that. And then there's the strategize piece. I draw a lot on the work for strategy from Carlos Saavedra from the INE Institute and Paul Engler for the Center for Working Poor, and I'm going to share some things that I've learned from them that really shape how I approach the work. So the main kind of theory of change that I have in terms of determining funding at the broadest level is how to open more political space for reform, because reform change, the transformations that we're trying to seek, meaning that if there's very little political room to act, the people who want to help you feel like they can't, and the people who are opposing you feel like, you're sort of getting hit from both ends. So I like to think of opening that space, increasing the political incentives to do what seems like a good idea. And there are a lot of different ways to go about that, but that's the main kind of a way of kind of conceptualizing the action here. I think a lot in terms of movement ecology, and that sort of shapes and this is again a framework from the INE Institute, shapes how I think about where to locate the funding. So we are sitting in the inside game right now by definition in the academy. When I first came into funding in 2015, a lot of the work in criminal justice was really inside game work, policy, advocacy, research into sort of data, statistics, things like that. I focused a lot of resources on structure-based organizing, community organizing, directly impacted-led organizing, and then also more recently into alternatives. There's a whole report on this called Funding Social Movements that lays out sort of different components of movement ecology in case that interests anyone. And then I also think a lot in terms of seasons of movement, by which I mean these sort of, again, this comes from INE, and that's Carlos's email in case this fascinates you and you want to contact him. But there's sort of spring being an early time where there's a lot of new organizations forming, potentially things can happen. Summer, there's a lot of energy in the system, a lot of attention being paid to the issue. Fall, things are starting to disintegrate. It's getting a little bumpy. You may have a harvest, a policy harvest in terms of people being polarized and mobilized to sort of pressed into meeting certain demands, and a winter being like a more difficult time, which is where I kind of think we are right now in criminal justice in some ways, so I think it's a warm winter. And here's another way of visualizing this sort of movement cycle in terms of the kind of energy and momentum going on. And this, again, is from INE. You can see how strongly I draw from their work. And a lot of the strategic work goes into thinking about, well, where are we in this cycle really? Because you could have a cool day in summer, so to speak. I think it's pretty clear that we are past, summer was 2020. There's never been such an explosion of energy on this issue. But where are we in terms of the fall and the winter? I kind of think we're in winter right now. Maybe we're in fall, but there's something that can happen in that time, and I could speak more about this after, but is this perception of failure after the big energy and momentum is gone. People think like, oh, no one cares anymore, we're not in it, but that's actually a really important time to analyze and assess the institutional progress, the leadership development progress, what has been built in order to start the next cycle, hopefully at a higher point than the last time, because you're trying to kind of build on where you were before. And I think there's actually room for the types of research that happens in this room to assist in understanding the nature of what has already occurred in order to build on it. So that's like a really quick trot through some of the sort of theoretical frameworks that I use in determining the funding. Okay, so now I'm going to shift to some hopefully helpful comments that could be useful to you all. In terms of, I mentioned that I come from social justice philanthropy. In thinking last night, I was really listening all day yesterday and trying to like figure out what I could say that could be helpful. This isn't like deeply produced work or anything, so I'm not like holding onto it too tightly. But I think that a lot of you may have experience raising funding from research funders who are like, I love research, let's know things, you produce knowledge, let's give you money for that. I don't come from that space, and I don't really understand or know the dynamics of how it works, so I can't give you very much there. I'm going to speak a little bit more about the social justice funders who have a strategy, meaning a set of goals, a place they're trying to get, and where your work might be relevant to that. That might be an opening for getting funding, and I'll come back to that. And then individual donors who are like less strategic maybe, but who might encounter on a more personal level you and your work, like if you were to give a talk that they saw and they might just like fall in love with it and sort of in a kind of somewhat more erratic, less strategic way, decide to get engaged with your work. And so one aspect that I'll come back to in a minute briefly is around like how to make yourself more visible out to the outside world, because that's maybe where you could catch some of those people. Okay, so for social justice funders, most of us, and I can't speak for my colleagues, but my impression is that we don't really know about research in academia. Like we don't really know. I didn't know anyone in this room before I came here. I think a lot of my colleagues are in a similar position. So there's not really much to hold on to. There's like whole levels of stuff that we don't understand, and so I think it can be hard to communicate across that chasm. So that's one point that is perhaps a challenge. We don't need to be convinced that it's a bad situation. So knowledge production that's around saying like, there are lots of problems. I think we'd be like, yep, that is true. We know that, we want to do something about it. And related to that, I think that I was speaking with one of your colleagues yesterday about an insight that what it may be the case that what it takes to get published is not the same as what it takes to get funded. So in terms of interesting, fascinating research, okay, like because we have no handles, we don't even know what's going on in research, that's not going to be like something that's a big get for us. But we're trying to achieve goals like passing a good policy. And so if your work can help move us towards that goal, that could be really interesting. So for example, is your work going to better equip organizers to make their case? Can you do work that helps engage more constituencies? I heard about religion yesterday, for example. Maybe there's faith constituencies who might hear that, understand that, and want to like participate because they felt like their interests were at stake. Or labor, we heard about yesterday as well. Students, how can we use your work? And I want to acknowledge here that like making work useful is like a particular condition of the sort of society that we live in. I don't I don't celebrate that, but I do think if you're practically trying to figure out how to access funding, you want to think about where do I fit in a larger strategy or an ecosystem of work that I can be contributing towards, and that the funders could understand that the goals of the people they're funding really already can be better served if your work is in the mix. I also want to say that, you have this separate role of engaging with students, which is really exciting because, like, I met Sarah yesterday and a couple of other students. That's exciting because we're kind of far removed from that, and the power and energy of students engaged on a topic who are working with you all, that seems kind of cool and even sort of separate from the particular aspects of the research. So I had some suggestions that I brainstormed yesterday. One is that, again, funders, particularly social justice funders, are already funding bodies of work. I mentioned to one of your colleagues today, SE Justice Group, who works with women with incarcerated loved ones. Gina who runs that organization, is well known to a lot of us funders. So if you know Gina and Gina tells us, hey, this person's work could be really helpful towards our goals, that's a very useful boost. Now, if Gina came to me and said, could you consider funding this particular research, it would really help me, that would mean a lot to me. And so thinking that's a sort of aspect of getting to know the field, not just in a collegial way, but to think about who is going to get you closer towards your goal of having a funder know about and understand and be excited about your work. Second would be producing sort of assets. I want to say, like, there's a lot that you probably know that you can just offhand kind of say because you've read 80,000 books and you can just kind of synthesize that. There's stuff there that I think can be really valuable to us in terms of understanding us and the field more broadly, understanding where we are, and I'll come back to some kind of suggestions on that. But I think there's things that might be come easily to you, but will be valuable to other people, and producing stuff on that could be helpful to getting yourself known. One of the bigger ideas I had yesterday is in terms of creating like a bucket that funders can put money into that then can be dispersed to a body of work where people are all kind of sharing a perspective or a set of values or something like that. So instead of funders having to get to know individual people and buy into particular pieces of work, if it was like, this is the Sociologist Abolition Research Network pot, then they could put money into that, and then people who actually know what's going on can figure out how to disperse it. So that's one thing to consider, particularly, if there's a vibe in this room and people are excited to be together, maybe that's something to build on. I also think that creating a way to exchange with the field can be good. How can you share what you've got, and how can you learn what people need in a more systematic way? Because otherwise it just depends on people having individual relationships to request or share that information, and a lot of those relationships don't exist. I also think connecting your students together might be interesting to consider. I also have some thoughts on some helpful research, potentially. One thing I really want to highlight from yesterday is helping us understand the opposition better. I think a colleague over here had mentioned that that's something, the gaze is towards the vulnerable versus the, oppressor. From a political, organizing, power building perspective, that seems kind of really interesting. Like getting more handholds in how to talk about or engage with, or frankly, exploit the vulnerabilities of the opposition is useful stuff. I also heard about, I think you were sharing yesterday about the $1 million police program that totally didn't work. That feels very useful in sort of making the case for the types of changes we're talking about. I also really was interested in the Du Bois-Davis conversation yesterday around tensions and abolition. And that's something I think that we don't hear a lot about. It's kind of a mishmash of ideas. And again, I feel like that's some of the stuff that you might just be able to rattle off because of all of the reading and study that you've done, but kind of distilling and synthesizing that. I can imagine some sort of simplified articles. I don't know if this is how you work. I'm just saying this is the kind of thing that could be really useful for us to have. So that's all. I'm out of time. This is the Substack. That's me on Twitter. I mostly just repost stuff. But thank you so much.
Good morning. So to those of you in the room and anyone watching on the streamed version of this conference, I just want to say how energizing and thought-provoking yesterday's and this morning's sessions have been. Energizing, thought-provoking, and I know we all intend action-oriented. I want to tell you about the Annie E. Casey Foundation, our mission, and how we and our grantees do our work. And I'll venture into philanthropy and grant-making foundations beyond Casey a bit more generally, but with the major caveat that if you know one foundation, you know exactly one foundation. And then finally, there are some threads and themes from yesterday and this morning I want to connect with. As I do all of that in 14 minutes or less, let me try to be useful to all of you, noting that most of you are university-based researchers, scholars, or scholar activists, and many, but not all of you, are relatively early in your career stages. I'll start by saying it seems exciting to be you. And I mean the creativity, the passion, the conceptual sharpness, the methodological commitment you've been sharing with us, these are inspiring. And each of you, in one way or another, You define yourself as being in the business of speaking truth to power. Where there are challenges or risks associated with that, you seem to be doing it with your eyes open and your moral and professional missions as your guiding stars. And then there's the fact that you're doing it in community. An intentionally constructed community that John and others described yesterday, to sharpen each other's ideas and research approaches, to shore up courage and resolve, to collectively carve out space within academia and the broader research and policy spheres for the conversations and lines of inquiry you are pursuing. It is important stuff, so I congratulate you and I'm here to encourage you. Frankly, a 27 or 37-year-old version of Steve Plank was sort of seeking and not knowing how to find an analogous community. So don't take that as a sob story from me. My life, my professional journey have turned out well, but there was some floundering, there was some searching in the wilderness where a set of co-travelers similar to you would have been awesome. But enough about me, enough about you. That's humor, okay? Let me tell you about the Annie E. Casey Foundation. You should call out humor so people know what they're experiencing. All right, the Annie E. Casey Foundation. We are a private philanthropy based in Baltimore with offices in Atlanta as well. Our grant making and other activities focus on building a brighter future for the nation's children, youth, and young adults. Our programs and investments focus on making sure all young people have the family connections, relationships, communities, and educational and employment opportunities they need to thrive. We seek to advance racial equity in all that we do because we know that children and families of color often face the greatest barriers to success. We have 5 grant-making units. I lead the one focused on research, evaluation, evidence, and data. Rod Martinez is another proud and excellent member of that team. Other units focus on strong and thriving communities, economic opportunity, strong families and permanent connections, and on the policy reform, advocacy, leadership development, and strategic communication that is designed to take evidence-based, data-rich, iteratively refined solutions to scale. Where I said strong families and permanent connections, that includes our connections to child welfare systems and juvenile justice systems. Systems improvement, systems reform, but also, very importantly, prevention and diversion strategies so that young people and their families don't need to have deep-end involvement with these systems. Investments in strong and thriving communities, investments in education, career readiness, and economic opportunity, investments in strong and thriving families. Those are the points of entry for where Casey's mission overlaps with all of the themes of this conference. In the coming days, if you're curious, I don't have slides, but I can share all these details and links with you. I encourage you to read a blog that we, aecf.org, posted just on March 26, 2024. Look for the blog title, Learn the Basics of Juvenile Justice. During the 2 days of this conference, it seems we've been talking mostly, though not exclusively, about the adult justice system, the adult criminal legal system. At Casey, we certainly pay attention to juveniles charged or sentenced as adults, and we pay attention to how the experiences of parents involved with the criminal legal system affect both them and their children. But the majority of our justice-related programmatic work, research, policy, and advocacy focuses on the juvenile justice system. So that March 26 blog, it has 12 or 13 really good links to other resources from the past several years. Among them, Juvenile Detention Explained, an examination of youth detention gaps by race and place, deep dives into diversion strategies, restorative justice, and transforming juvenile probation. 8 principles to transform care for young people in the justice system. Reducing over-reliance on youth incarceration, effective alternatives to confinement, and specific ways to get involved as an advocate for change. I'll be honest with you, you're not going to see the word abolition written across our strategies, publications, and toolkits, but you'll see a strong commitment to shrinking the footprint of confinement. you'll see an acknowledgement that young people do naturally, as a part of adolescent and human development, test boundaries and sometimes try on identities that society has called deviant. Young people do sometimes cause harm and make mistakes. People or communities who have been harmed have rights, and harm should be acknowledged. But past and current ways that society and systems respond leave a lot to be desired. We need to move away from a culture of surveillance, punishment, and confinement, and toward more developmentally appropriate responses, including options that keep kids away from the justice system altogether. You will see from us and our grantees attention to the problems of disproportionality in surveillance or police and court contact. None of us should equate rates of system involvement with rates of deviance or law breaking. We all know the story is more complicated and troubling than that. I want to mention one more example relevant to this conference. Look for a blog on our website from December of 23 entitled Youth Lockup Facility Transformed into a Community Hub. That blog links to a 6-minute video, a really good one, on the transformation of a Harris County, Texas, Faith, I see you there, Harris County, Texas juvenile correction facility into a community hub. It's called the Opportunity Center. It offers classes in which justice-involved youth and the broader community can develop skills and build relationships. This video explains how the adaptive reuse of the building is part of a larger youth justice movement away from punitive approaches and toward options that promote accountability, positive connections, and meaningful opportunities to position youth for long-term success. When you watch this, you're going to see 800-pound metal doors cast aside, because that's what we don't want in this building. That's not what this building's going to be for now. Other things we invest in through our juvenile justice strategy portfolio, through the READ, Research, Evaluation, Evidence, and Data group that Rod and I are part of, or through our policy portfolios. Other things include, you can write this down if you want or ask me later, ProData, a free tool for making data-driven decisions in youth justice. Look at our August of 23 blog, keyword pro-data, ProData. See whether this data and data visualization tool would be useful to you, your community partners, or the advocates in your life. CJARS, the Criminal Justice Administrative Record System. It's housed at the University of Michigan. We're just one of their funders. We see value in this joint project of the U.S. Census Bureau and the University of Michigan. Their assembling of person-level data from jurisdictions all across the nation is a unique resource, including for the research agendas many of you pursue. This is the first nationally integrated research data repository that follows individual trajectories from arrest to charge to disposition to sanction. We at Casey would be thrilled, beyond thrilled, if a growing and ever more diverse and inclusive set of researchers, journalists, advocates, and others were engaging these data. Rod or I could tell you more. You might be interested in the individual level data and the ways it can be linked to a range of social, economic, demographic, and administrative records. Or you might be interested in the Outcomes Explorer that the CJARS team is about to release, a new online user interface and data visualization tool for understanding the scope and impact of the criminal justice system in the United States. They say criminal justice system. I recognize and respect that many of us prefer to say criminal legal system. So, what are my bits of advice or inside baseball knowledge as any of you are seeking to understand philanthropy and grant-making foundations better? I want to demystify the world of philanthropy if it feels difficult to understand and navigate. I spent 19 years after my doctorate as a university-based researcher and faculty member, and then 1 year in federal government and 5 or 6 years at the nonprofit research firm American Institutes for Research. And all of that is to say I've put in my time pursuing grants and contracts to support research and evaluation projects. And I know firsthand that the process of seeking funding from philanthropy tends to feel quite different from responding to an RFA or an RFP from a federal agency, or preparing a proposal for a grant competition run by a professional association, or seeking a contract from a federal or state agency. So first, some things about Casey, and then about navigating and interacting with philanthropy more generally. The blunt news first. The Annie E. Casey Foundation does not accept or review unsolicited proposals. For the vast majority of grants, our staff will approach an organization directly and invite them to submit a proposal. Occasionally, we solicit applications for a targeted project through an open call for proposals. Also, I want to set your expectations by characterizing us as a medium-sized grant maker with a US-based mission. I cannot have you thinking Steve Plank and his immediate colleagues have grant funds available for 30 or 40 of you in this room, or 500 of you on the online conference. That is just not our reality. But if that's the blunt news, then I have more encouraging thoughts also. We do want to be in conversation with research teams exactly like yours and the network of people and communities you're connected with. We're all in the human and community well-being business. We're all in the data-rich and evidence-driven improvement business. My most direct advice is to be in conversation, be in relationship. For whatever foundations you'd like to know and explore, attend their webinars and events. Surf their websites and follow them on social media. Make in-person connections with program officers and other staff at conferences and convenings. Know that most foundations do have strategic priorities and points of view. We're not neutral or agnostic on strategy. So explore the overlap between a foundation's priorities and your research and policy directions. We, Casey, may not accept unsolicited proposals, but conversations and exchanges of ideas, initial relationships, exchange of ideas, that's how we get things started in my professional world. And if one foundation is not in a position to fund you, we really do see it as our professional duty and desire to make introductions to our peers in other organizations or other funding opportunities that we think might be a good match to what you're pursuing. So in brief, review websites and other public-facing materials on mission, vision, and funding priorities. Make connections with program officers, portfolio managers, and senior leaders via conferences and webinars and more. Expect that we in philanthropy, demand that we in philanthropy should be welcoming and transparent in our interactions with you. You know, we're entrusted with resources that should benefit society, hard stop. Know that philanthropies differ from one another in their practices regarding regular rhythms of requests for proposal, requests for applications, whether they accept unsolicited proposals or only by invitation, and the specifics of a foundation's prioritized funding areas. In any case, please do not hesitate to initiate the conversation by email or phone or otherwise. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Can actually zoom in. So we're going to try and figure out how that's going to happen. So give us just a sec, I think.
Can I sit over here so I'm not?
Oh, yeah, yeah, so you can see. Yay, welcome, Jantel. Yep, thank you, Jantel. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good to be here.
Yes, I believe the email instructions you received, we just wanted to get to know your foundation a little better, and both Chloe and Steve have already talked, and we'll have you join in with them for Q&A. But we'd love to hear more about what you're doing and major priorities you see. I hope you've been able to peek in on some of the sessions and be able to relate some feedback to what your mission is based on what you've seen here as well. So thank you so much for joining us.
Happy to do so. And good afternoon, everyone. Really good to be here. Grateful for virtual technology. Had a little one that had a very bad sports injury and underwent emergency surgery. So still on the West Coast. Wish I could have been in person, but grateful to join. virtually with you all. Jontel White, I am with the Shot Foundation. I serve as our Senior Vice President of Programs and Advocacy. Meaning I oversee our various grant-making portfolios and programmatic initiatives. It's a real privilege to be in community with you all. I come from the nonprofit space, having worked in racial justice advocacy for a number of years here in Los Angeles as well as within New York, a bit of local government as well, with mayors and the local school districts. Before joining academia, my PhD in sociology from Columbia, so grateful to be in community with folks, my colleagues in philanthropy. The Shot Foundation is about 30 years old. We have a large our history within the Northeast, but we are a national intermediary foundation, which means we subgrant and also raise from our colleagues with a focus. Our theory of change and grant making is really to provide for increase, accelerate education and racial justice movement building, and to really create loving systems that advance students' opportunity to learn. So we think about that opportunity to learn and this system around learning as in and outside of the schoolhouse. So we think about health indicators, economic indicators, housing indicators that all inform students' well-being and their ability not only to access high quality education, but also to and through the various schooling experiences. So our focus in that, we fund Black and Brown led grassroots organizing nationally. We have folks that are at the local level, regional, and statewide leading campaigns. They vary from fighting school voucher fights within North Carolina, fighting for mental health supports and against punitive school discipline and punishment within Mississippi, Louisiana, Rhode Island. These are just some of the states that we represent. They're winning transportation and economic justice fights within New Orleans. They're getting out the vote in indigenous communities within California and throughout the West. They are largely both youth and parent led organizations. And we think about this as a vital part of building our multiracial democracy. These are the front line. We believe that those closest and experiencing the problem are also the arbiters of the solutions. And so we are very proud to invest in those at the front lines in ideating and advocating for systems change. Many of our grantees are fighting from a liberatory frame, and many have an explicit abolitionist frame in their work. That this idea of a system being reimagined in order for everyone, regardless of their race, sexual orientation, economic status, gender, the system must be reimagined in order for all of us to be truly free. And so our principles as a foundation are really to be community centered in our work, both on the grassroots organizing pillar, but also I want to go back to our theory of change is really fostering loving systems that advance students' opportunity to learn. So we have also narrative change programs, as well as a research collaborative through which we all are focused on how does this help us advance living systems for students. So particularly our narrative change work is our public school grad initiative that really is focused on fostering greater attention around the brilliance, around the beauty of public education and those students and alumni, educators as well. And so this is really building the base of folks that are at the front lines of experiencing public education, encountering a lot of the negative narratives that we see so often clouded around the classroom. On the research side, which is obviously of greater interest to many folks, our grassroots research collaborative is really an effort to bridge what our grassroots organizations are looking for in terms of data support. So there are commissioned reports that the foundation develops to most foregrounding our Loving Cities Index, in which I'm happy to share these materials as well. They're also linked on our website. But we look across a number of cities, usually about 15 in each iteration. We're currently under the third now and looking for vendors to support this work. But it's a way to, based on our framework of about 4 areas in which we imagine a loving system around economic, around health, around education, that we really are thinking about how well is this city performing in terms of its way to serve students. And so the report really goes down the list in sort of rating the current indicators and how they shape students' opportunity to learn in those various cities. That is one in terms of a commission report. The second is our Black Males in Education report. And so we look at some of the top, most in metropolitan areas, the districts, public school districts that have the largest numbers of African American students, and really drill down in terms of the performance of Black males within those locales. And so we will have the latest report, actually it's being released in a couple of weeks. But those are 2 of our commission reports around education that really highlight some of the recent data that serve as, again, a tool for our grassroots partners in advocacy in their locales, but also in terms of policy shifts and change. The second is that as an intermediary, we are also not just focused on funding, but also focused on shifting philanthropy. So we think about the reports as also opportunities for ourselves and our colleagues to identify the opportunities for more investment. Where are we seeing opportunities to dive deeper in terms of support for education and public education in and outside of the classroom? The other is in terms of our policy collaboratives. So I mentioned those as some of our commission reports. The other is data sheets. And so these are areas of which our grantees and in community with our grantees who've identified needs in terms of really zeroing down on the key data metrics. So a number of states in which we work, looking to sort of have state level analysis around those various indicators, broken down by race, gender, et cetera. This might be in terms of school discipline, it may be in terms of suspensions, a number of various indicators. So we are constantly in community and looking to further our networks with scholars that support these efforts. Great to follow both Steve and Chloe, who have kind of laid the groundwork in terms of how do we engage, tips for engaging philanthropy. We as a foundation typically offer, most of our grants are operated in terms of invitation. And so really +1 in terms of the real value add of being a community, whether through conferences, attending events, meeting with various staff members, this goes for SHOT and across philanthropy. Would definitely recommend that as an approach, particularly for those within the social justice philanthropy space. I mentioned the number of reports that we as a foundation publish and various data sheets, if you will, state level data sheets. But this is ongoing. So our mission to really advance movement building for our partners, we are in constant community about what are opportunities they are seeing and identifying. And in that, being in community and conversation with scholars that, are working around school discipline, are working in Mississippi, or have, connections is an immediate through line so that we can begin to build out. The other aspect of it is within our grassroots research collaborative, we have a table of about 16 organizations across labor, advocacy, and even philanthropy. UNIDO's National Urban League, the various organizations across the nation, they're national membership organizations, of which we convene to really collaborate on state and federal policy actions. And in that table, as they're convening, there are opportunities for scholars to be a part, to share their work, as well as to support in the synthesis or analysis of some of the actions coming out of those tables. So that's the other area that for SHOT constantly looking to engage in scholarly work for folks to be a part of that table. On an ongoing, there are also opportunities in terms of the various events and panels we hold with our grantee partners. And so whether webinars or conferences, those who have expert knowledge in those various areas aligned with their work to provide that support and to be within our network of folks that we can really lift up to speak to those various areas. I'm gonna pause there. I hope that kind of gave an overview both of SHOT and the opportunities research-wise that we currently are engaging around and ways to be in conversation and make overlap with some of the interest here. But again, good to be in conversation and happy to continue on.
I want to thank the panelists. I'm not sure. Okay, yeah, I was going to ask about the lighting. So I don't know how we're going to do with John Tell speaking, but I'm sure you've done this before. So they have us in the booth. So thanks, John. I want to start with what I've been amazed at with every other discussant. I'm now like, oh, this is way harder than I thought it was. But I could try and summarize everything that was just said, but I think it was so much new information, especially given the more junior researchers that are dominant in the room, and I'm trying to encourage you all, which is antithetical to your ultimate goal, many of your ultimate goals, which is tenure, right? But I'm trying to, some of you are more on the cusp about to get tenure, but I'm trying to, as a group, have us start to think about how to move this way, where you may not have to be the PI, you could be a co-PI, and start building relationships now, because I'm from Chicago, right? I'm from Chicagoland, more generally, Evanston specifically. And one thing I always, people who have seen me and heard me talk before, one thing I always try to do is I don't like to talk about it. I like to be about it. And if we're talking about abolition and social justice and reforms, or even revolution, however you want to take this, you shouldn't be just saying or advocating for it. What I love about our panelists is even Steve, who says Casey isn't directly about abolition, whereas Chloe and Jantel say, no, we're more directly into funding grassroots activities, right, which can lead to, seeding the groundwork for abolition. I think that this panel was very exciting for me because I'm a recovering community organizer, right? I left community organizing to come into the academy because in the late 90s, when I was doing grassroots community organizing and political organizing as well, there wasn't much connection with the academy. We didn't have research. What did you call them, Jantel? I'm sorry, got to put my glasses on. It's the old man move. Data sheets, right? And that's ostensibly what Chloe was asking for, right? While you may provide them at the state level, it sounds like we need them maybe for foundations, right? But I left community organizing because there just wasn't enough strategic thinking about how not only to go after funding, but even how to grapple with some of the larger issues, right? I was dealing with small issues that were more neighborhood focused. We were in the process of building a metropolitan organization, and those growing pains, which a lot of NGOs go through, they can teach a lot. But I felt like I had more to give. That's why I came into the academy. I went to get an MPP. There's not a whole lot of us who go and get a professional degree first and then a PhD. So I have an MPP and a PhD because I wanted to figure out the best way to research issues, the best way to bring equity and foregrounding equity. That's why I'm a sociologist. I didn't go into econ because policy is made out of the two building blocks of, and this is no offense to economists, right? No offense. I've macroeconomics, stats all day. I did that. I've lived that life. No offense to, nobody asked you, Siri. No offense to economists, but economists focus on efficiency. I think the strategic, what sociologists can bring to the table is an understanding, a better and deeper understanding of equity. We're supposed to, when we intervene in policy, we're supposed to talk about equity and efficiency. Economists just discovered inequality like in the last 3 to 4 years. They're just thinking about subnational inequality, right? And that's no diss to the field, but they're acting like oh, it is. But yeah, it is. But there's no diss to a lot of social scientists doing this work. But how do we produce research that is actionable, right? Things that we really care about, and it can't all be quantitative. So that's why I want to turn to the panelists, because I think that I have a couple of questions I can ask. I've given you more of what's even brought me to this point, where I was, what is that, over 20 years ago? This is how old I am. So what brought me into grad school and everything else. But I think some of the questions that were raised, I'll just ask each of you to respond to one or two questions I have. So for Chloe, you talked about buckets for bodies of work, which I loved. And as a former organizer, I love the fact that you talked about basically producing a power analysis, which means you know the jungle that you're entering, right? So how do you exploit the vulnerability of the opposition? That question. If you wanted to engage with us a little bit more to explain that a little bit more, how could research specifically exploit the vulnerability of the opposition? What are some ways researchers could potentially do that that would be meaningful for where you're sitting? How could we produce something that's meaningful for where you're sitting? And I'll let you, well, I only have a few minutes left, so I'm going to ask Steve and then Chantel a question as well. So for CJARS in particular, because you are a PhD, Steve, I have a similar question. Are there ways that CJARS isn't being used that you've seen could potentially be used from what's in here? I have some things in my head. I'm thinking about my undergrad researchers. I need to acknowledge two of them that have come in today, Emma and Hans as well. I'm thinking of Emma and Hans, well, Hans in particular, who's been looking at some education outcomes. Yeah, we need to familiarize him with CJARS for some of the work we're doing. But how do you think CJARS could be used based on what you've seen here? And lastly, for Chantel, your theory of change, I got really excited because I was like, yeah, if this was around in 1998, I know the Schott Foundation's been around for a while, but you weren't at the Schott Foundation then. So if the Schott Foundation was doing this in 1998, I might not be a professor, right? I think a lot of how you talked about making data useful for your partners. So I want you to talk a little bit more about how the role that Schott plays in connecting researchers to your NGO partners, or what role does Schott play? Do we as researchers already need to have connections with state and local governments or NGOs, right? And then we come to you that way because you don't accept unsolicited proposals? How exactly does that process work? So I appreciate each of you responding to those questions in any order, and then I'm going to ask Hans and or Emma, whoever is doing the mic, to pass it around. Oh, and if folks have to leave, I know a few folks will be traveling, make sure to get some food so you can't say Brown didn't feed you. Pack lunch is on the way out. So Hans, I'll hand the mic over to you, and I'll let Chantel, Chloe, and Steve answer the question.
Thank you so much. I realize that hearing my colleagues speak, that I'd kind of failed to give a big important point, which is that my pure specific focus is on ending mass incarceration. That's what I've done for almost 20 years. So all of the funding work and all of the advising and all of the kind of analysis and strategy is all really focused on that. So wanted to make sure to put that out there. So how to exploit vulnerability? I would first say why do you want to exploit vulnerability? So you have a background in organizing. For others in the room, kind of thinking about the ecology wheel that I presented to you before, each of these components kind of can, if working together, create opportunities for other components to kind of step into. So for example, just to take a kind of small basic one, or a bigger one, we all lived, 2020, mass mobilization, 25 million people in the streets creates what we sometimes call heightened the contradictions. It created a lot of pressure for people to act. And then it comes to the organizers who can sharpen a particular set of demands, which don't come out of mass mobilization, by the way. I'm going a little off track, but I feel this is an important point. A lot of people will critique Occupy or Me Too or Black Lives Matter. What are your demands? That's not their job. The job is hugely increase, or their effect is increase public salience, conversation, really move the Overton window. But the shaping of particular demands comes down to these labor organizers, community organizers, advocates, people who have a particular structure and a constituency that they can point to and speak on behalf of and say to the inside game, this is what we need to see happen in order to respond to all those people out there on your steps. If you want them to calm down, do these things. Now, the things will never be as big as the mass mobilization demanded, and that's another longer conversation. Okay, so when we have a big public movement on this, you got a lot of leverage going into the inside game and saying, pass these things. And they're like, how fast? Let's do it. Let's get everyone to calm down. When you don't have a lot of people in the streets, you're dealing in more kind of normal back and forth politics, where the types of players we're talking about, like police, associations or unions, corrections unions, prosecutor associations, these retailers associations, these different bodies have political presence and power because they, have strong lobbying. The LAPD and sheriff between them have, I think, 57 full-time PR staff. Full-time PR. We don't have that many, brilliant communications people across the whole country working on this issue. They have that in Los Angeles. So I think we're doing pretty well given, considering those circumstances. So when you're up against that, and you're in the public space, maybe you're at a council hearing or you're, back and forth in the media, it can the way that the research can be helpful is equipping the people who are in the mix, who are helpful electeds or who are trying to be allies, who are organizers or advocates or helpful journalists or whatever, quickly and sort of compellingly respond with useful stuff. So one example of this might be, I haven't watched it with these eyes, but I really encourage you all to check out a recent Breakfast Club episode, the podcast, it's on YouTube. Olayemi Olurin, who's a grantee of ours, went on the Breakfast Club, and I don't know how many people are watching it, so I'll just say it was a wonderful experience to watch her engage with Mayor Adams, and she brought so much. She was so prepared for this debate, but when you realize what she is pulling from, when she's like, boom, 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 you did this, you did that, or here are the implications, or here are the stats, the content of that, a lot of that would be the type of work that people like you are creating. That's what you're sort of equipping the Alayamis of the world with that kind of ammunition. Now, it can be funny to think of years of work being reduced to a quick kind of soundbite, but at the right moment, it actually can, in the right hands, it can really turn things around. So there's longer conversations than just that quick sparring, but that was a pretty significant. I really encourage you to watch. It's a very, very enjoyable interview to take in. But in longer sort of engagements in these public policy spheres, when, again, legislators or decision makers are uncertain or whatever, or community leaders or faith leaders, business leaders, different people are like, I'm not sure, what do you think? I mean, it seems like this is true, right? But if you heard, well, we did a careful analysis and this $1 million extra program did nothing, that's helpful to have in your pocket when you're engaging and trying to push back and say we should actually allocate more funding to these other kinds of places. So I think the vulnerability you're exploiting there is there's this sort of assumption that these actors have all of the data and research behind them, which they don't, and that can be revealed. And then they are sort of course, treated as the like custodians of safety or the people that everyone should trust. And so developing research that helps show that that is not necessarily the case can be helpful. And then the second thing I really just have to say, again, from an organizing perspective, these institutions are not monoliths themselves. So there are people within them who may feel a different way. So maybe this is for the ethnographers in the room, like lots of police officers. We heard yesterday from someone who was speaking to retired corrections officers, I believe, who had a really rough go. Telling more of those stories, the people participating on the other side are having a really bad time. Less about creating sympathy and more about kind of breaking down this notion of just like the bastions and custodians of safety and law say this. Well, actually, they say a lot of things. We could hear a lot more of those stories and understand that more. We could hear why there's a 20 to 40% vacancy rate in many states in police departments and corrections departments, because they all think it's a terrible job, it's abusive, exploitative, they don't want to kill people in the street. Hearing more of those kinds of stories can kind of complicate the position of those types of unions, associations, or certain politicians in saying, obviously, we need to do X and Y in the minds of the public, of journalists, other electeds, and so on.
I'll respond to what you asked about CJAR's Criminal Justice Administrative Record System. And interesting that I'm really happy to be able to talk about that, a large quantitative thing, but it also gives me the excuse to say the range of types of data, types of evidence. We embrace a really broad range, and all the evidence debates that are out there. What counts as evidence? Who gets to declare what is valid or useful evidence? We actually love those debates and want to be part of it. We take stance for a very broad range, but then think about what evidence is needed at this stage of a project, this stage of understanding or action prompting. So let me just say, we take our stance for broad, but you asked me about a big quantitative one. A complement to what this CJARS is, I think anyone who tries to just understand the scope and contours of either the adult criminal justice system or the juvenile justice system, it's a patchwork of data not connected out there in these small jurisdictions and hard to get one's hands on. The University of Michigan team is making it happen, and it's rather amazing. They do position themselves as kind of not in advocacy mode, playing it straight down the middle, some button-down economists, and I say that without derision. I say that's what it takes to get the inroads and build the trust. So let's actually appreciate that. But there is plenty of room to go well beyond economists and the researchers who want to be in conversation with advocacy. This can and should happen. And the principal investigators, the funders of CJARS, are excited for this to happen. These 2 days, all this talk about prison booms and busts and closures and prisons, jails, detention centers, it's gotten my creative juices flowing, taught me some things I didn't understand. The way individual person-level records of confinement in a place can be linked to all of these other census and demographic and social data, and I think, someone will call me on this later if I'm wrong, you can understand what people are confined in a place and also where they have lived previously. We can understand at a time of a prison closure, I think we could do simulations or thought experiments about, depending on where that person is counted by the Census Bureau as it affects flows of federal and state funds. Okay, first, what are the implications of the status quo? This person is confined here but used to live in this zip code. What if we change the rules of how dollars flow? And if we're going to close this prison, what your Brown undergrad team has been thinking about, let's think next month, next year, next decade, how is this going to affect the community? It's just a resource to go even deeper with that thought experiment. I will say, expand the network of researchers. The CJARS data is currently being used by a relatively small number of researchers doing really good, careful studies. If we actively looked for researchers from HBCUs, if we actively taught journalists how to access and use these data, maybe not the person level data, but this new outcome explorer. So just expanding the reach. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Steve. Chantel?
Sure. So to this question of, how do we make the data useful for our partners? How do we, serve as this bridge between grassroots organizations and researchers? A couple of things come up One, as a foundation, we really center a trust-based approach. So large number of our grants, all of our grants to grassroots partners are under general operating expenses, so they're not, restricted in terms of that use. Many of our partners are multi-issue. We have a real anchored focus on education and racial justice, and so they are advancing education fights with also intersection with many others in their locales. And so with that, we are in, our approach is, it's fluid, and so to kind of give a direct answer, what does that connection look like? It's through organic intention, if you will. Organically through our touch points with our partners on how, and let me also back up, in addition to being trust-based, we have a center for long-term investment. So we know that systems change, takes a while to shift. It takes a bit to steer the ship in a different direction. And so we are invested over several years with our grantee partners. In that, it is a constant touch point around what are the successes, what are the challenges. We have a really good rapport with our partners, separate, and built over time so that there is a real deep, not only connection, but realistic reflection from them on pain points, on opportunities, on needs, that it isn't sort of, we have a sweet spot of them feeling comfortable to really give us the real. How can we really real, right? Like workshop what is necessary to get to this next level. And so with that, we are able to jointly identify it's this data, right? Like we are talking broadly, but don't have the time and space. I think that's the neat nexus of your position of being able to go deep and really broaden out what are the opportunities or what were the learnings from X thing, right, that you've studied. And so folks can come to us in different ways. It is through those touch points with our program officers that it will come up through our grantee partners. Some have participated, in YPAR studies, and so their own participation or engagement with researchers through their organization or individually, and that mentioning up is how sort of we kind of build those connections, or direct needs, right? If our grantee partners are saying recently, the voucher fight, the governor of North Carolina, really expanding school vouchers and urgent campaigns being lifted up by grassroots partners seeking to protect and expand public funding for education. Data around that, building up, what are the stats around the school voucher fight within the state? Those are pieces of information that they do broadly, but knowing across the state outside of their particular school districts would be helpful in really, making the case. And so we will then, right, look through our network of partners, of scholars, right, who can help them in really answering the call and help them in the campaign. So it looks like that in terms of those touch points. What's the need? How can we, right, leverage our resources, given our position, to really help them in the effort and to keep them in the fight. The other is, through, again, under this organic intention, we're aiming to be more visible to you. Forums like this are helpful. Our president, John Jackson, will be at the American Education Research Association conference in a few weeks, and other spaces, so that, as your work, a part of that, subsection, conclusion, recommendations often have policy focus, often have learnings and insights about organizations or individuals that will be helpful to surface. And so we want to also extend the door. We see less of it, but there is a need for it so that it isn't, isolated within academia, but those that are experiencing the work and that, directly would benefit to provide that forum. So we think about our connections, town halls, with our partners as spaces to really lift that up. Again, being in the fight, you don't always have the privilege to sit back and say, how did we get here? What is the best next step? What are the insights, right? And so surely it is done strategically, but is a lot going on and you're thinking about the next wave. And so being able to really increase our knowledge about where researchers' findings are, what are their learnings, and being able then to kind of bring that back or just create a forum, right? So we have a biannual, every 2 years, convening across our opportunity to learn partners. And so you think about, spaces to have research really surface in the broad issues that our grantees are really engaging. So it's organic intention. It is largely through our communications with grantees and their needs identified that we will then begin to activate on particular areas. The data sheets is one example of that. One of our partners through the Education Law Center, who worked at the University of Kentucky. Currently, the Center for Transformation of Schools at UCLA is was commissioned for our Black Male Report to come out in a few weeks. So work at a particular center, your own findings, and reaching out and again to this notion of being in community so that you are sharing your work. It may not be a direct opportunity that exists and you see on our website, but because for SHOT, we're in community and always looking for how we can support, there may be a neat intersection and new opportunity just based on that meeting.
Thank you, Jantel. Had to move around a little bit during this session, but we have a couple of minutes left before I give closing remarks. Is Heather, I see Heather's hand. If you can get her the mic, please, Emma or Hans.
Thank you so much. Again, I'm Heather Schoenfeld. I'm an associate professor of sociology at Boston University. And this was really, really informative. So I'm hopefully I'll articulate this question okay. So one of the things that I think may be frustrating for academics and researchers is that we would, I think, love to meet community organizations in this sort of touch point moments where they need data kind of on the spot or with a little bit of notice. But a lot of our research in academia moves very slowly. And that's partly because we're doing a lot of other things. As you say, we're teaching students, we're running academic programs and so on. And so our research takes a while, and we can't always sort of drop things, our research to work on getting data to community organizations quickly. And so it's a little bit frustrating, Chloe, I think, to hear you say that, I think all of you say that there aren't really forums, there aren't really ways that you're getting the knowledge that we're creating over the long term, right? So, just for example, the question about, who are the people who are sort of blocking reform and how are they doing that? A lot of us in this room have been studying that for years. Right, and the research is out there, and yes, it's published in academic journals, right? Which I don't blame you for not reading, right? But the question is, what are some ways in which, as academics, we can make our research more available to you? Are there new sort of structures that need to be built to allow for that to happen? And what are there some ideas that you have that would be helpful in that regard? So that's for anybody who would like to answer. Thank you so much.
I have a thought on that, which is one is increasing the number of relationships between people in this room and people in other parts of the field. Understanding that we're kind of in different fields, but other people doing the work. So I've talked to some of you, we may now have touch points. The more touch points there are, the more likely it is that people will have a conversation and be like, I need this, I know where to get it. So relationships are key. I think that I had one thought around, and this is, I don't know, pie in the sky ass, but like if there were all of the people in this room plus like 50 people that I could read, or 20 people from this sort of work in the same place, where you could imagine an exchange where you create the most basic, simplified versions of what you're talking about, like the 1 minute version, not the 15 plus 5 extra minute version, but the most simplified, like, here are propositions that we've been exploring. We can show you ABC, we found D, F isn't true, we're looking at this kind of thing. Like, then, and then they can also say, we have been trying to show X or Y, or over the long term, not just like, I need it tomorrow, I'm talking to the mayor, but like, there's a question that came up around, like, in Los Angeles, how the relationship between evictions and contact with the criminal justice system. So people are interested in homelessness. If you look at the causes of homelessness, you will not see criminal justice system contact on any list that I've looked at anyways. It's going to be poverty and, all these other things. But when you talk to people, they're like, the reason people are getting bounced out of their houses is they or someone in their household has picked up a case and that has destabilized things financially, or the landlord threw them out. But like, they can't make that, there's nothing to draw on to show that. And so you can imagine, or maybe there is, we don't know what that is. So like, there's these sort of longer running questions where you're like, everyone's so focused on homelessness, we are actually a part of like, reducing criminal justice system contact is a key piece of strategies to reduce homelessness, which the state of California is spending billions upon billions of dollars to do right now. So it's like, I think that creating opportunities to sort of literally come together and be like, this is what we know, this is what we want to know, and like see what comes out. I also do think that, like, I don't know. I mean, I think that listservs can work sometimes, like, just as a way to kind of be in conversation. Not always. Often they die, and that's fine. That's fine. But like, what is there a stopping point? Could there? I don't know. Is there? You can imagine like a platform, a communication device of some kind where people can say, hey, people in abolitionist sociology land, I'm calling you from, criminal justice, like ending mass incarceration land. We have this question, or we're noticing this thing, or this thing is happening. Maybe someone wants to look at it. So I do think more vehicles helpful. And I do think that, like, finding ways to communicate your work, which, by the way, we may have read things that are drawing on your work. So not like there's no transfer of information going on. But I don't know to what extent you are accustomed to creating simplified versions of your work for people to draw upon. And if that's not normally happening, like, that's maybe something to consider doing.
I'll add to that in terms of, and I definitely hear the notion of capacity, right? Being able to have your flow of various articles and things that you're working on and feeling like those are separate. The things to provide and share with various partners. I will also challenge that in that, to the extent that making it be information accessible can aid, right, in your research flow, because the actual product is a different form. It's synthesizing and condensing the high level, and perhaps not even at the same style of analysis, right? So it's a different sort of pinpoint statistic, mapping it. I'm thinking about our data sheets particularly, that is, just gathering that information from various pockets and synthesizing it in a short form. So I also want to just kind of offer that as it's an opportunity as well in advancing work that you're doing and not separate. It can be very integrated into it, and also aid to this problem or opportunity that we've surfaced around what is the way that we can increase this bridge across academia and community spaces. And because those spaces, those types of products is a middle ground, have a wider reach, tend to, in other spaces, even beyond the academic conferences, it can also aid the audience, right? Build up the audience in those spaces that folks can direct toward you. So I just want to put that as an offering, in that the thought about it separate, definitely understand in terms of capacity, but there is an integration at times. The two spaces we're looking, to build, I mentioned our convening amongst partners and opening that up both to philanthropy and potentially researchers that it can engage. So I think we have to build the spaces for scholars to participate within the community and vice versa. But it's still an area to build off of. There's a question in the chat to me around research-based films and the funding of that. I want to offer the arts as well. I often see, documentaries where scholars are featured that are also opportunity to draw folks to understand your work. It is areas that SHOT has sponsored previously in terms of research-based films and other types of artistic modes. So offer that is also a way that those audience spaces, and we can kind of continue to bridge the various fields.
Thanks for catching that question in the chat as well. Steve, did you want to reply to this directly, or
I have an answer, but afterwards I'll tell you. We can go to another question.
We have time for one more, right? Nicole, you want to go ahead?
I just want to push back on this idea, like listservs are insufficient. They're like way too small, and there's an enormous amount of critical scholars that are out there, like writing in the New York Times, talking to The Economist, Time Magazine. You said decreasing system contact. That's a jargon. That's called police. You could have a separate headline that says police create evictions, police create poverty. Decreasing contact is a euphemism for police practices, punitive ones. I think that more academics need to be trained in PR, and I will tell you, I have done more media around, let's say, prosecutor complicity in police murder. That's what that's called. Prosecutors enable police murder. I don't see many funders wanting to pick this up, because what it would take is a funding agency courageous enough to expose the police violence on a mass scale. And so what a lot of researchers have to do is choose. Do I water down a message and talk in euphemisms so that the funding organization will allow it? Or do I say what I think I mean? So I have a New York Times piece called Chicago's Racist Cops and Racist Courts, and I mobilized a decade's worth of evidence. Does anybody want to fund the additional research that comes with it? That's called quote unquote controversial. So I'm putting it out there because there's a lot of academics that are not focusing on listservs. They're really able to translate. The problem is the funders they worry about the blowback. And so I'd love for y'all to, while we're all here, please address that, because we're out there, but we're very much ignored by funders, not the media, not big media, right? Conglomerates, not Netflix documentaries, and not peer-reviewed journals. We're in all the spaces. The funders get nervous.
I would say that I think that
And I'm down, fired up.
First of all, there's a great piece in The Intercept by Akilah Lacey recently on the DA of Minneapolis, who is prosecuting a cop, and for that is getting heavily attacked. And she sort of documented a lot of examples of this as part of these. One of the reasons why the progressive prosecutor movement is so vulnerable to sort of police pushback is because they are prosecuting some cops, and so there's interesting stuff there. But to your main point, I think that the type of funder who is going to embrace that perspective is a one who is less likely to fund research because they're funding organizing. Because traditionally we think of like research as
findings. I just want to make that clear.
Findings,
Yeah,
sure.
not perspective. That makes it sound like a viewpoint, a subjectivity. This is like data.
Right.
Yeah.
Forgive me for misspeaking. I don't mean to characterize it like that. So I think that we think of data work because there are foundations who focus on data, and they tend to, there's a thing running together here. There are foundations who focus on data, and they tend to have a certain politic and an approach. And I think other funders see that, and they're like, I'm not like that. I'm over here with the organizers. We're not trying to, and I'm not saying that you guys are doing this, we're not trying to endlessly understand that there is a problem, which is what we may understand those foundations to be supporting. Is there a problem? Is there a problem? Is there really? Yes, there's a problem. So like, let's do something about it. And so then we turn our attention towards organizers, and I'm saying organizers more broadly, but also literally like people who are base building and leading these campaigns. And I think that research and data, certainly in my mind in the past, has been like, that's on this other category of problem understanding that I don't feel the need to like devote precious resources towards. So you might be caught in this spot in between, like there are people with money or some kind of stewardship over money who are not at all concerned or afraid or nervous about the types of information you're talking about supplying, proving up. but their focus is really in a different part of the ecosystem. And so I think that like this may be this kind of subset of all of the people doing data research work. There's a portion that are maybe heavily represented in this room that are looking at it from are proving up the I'm trying to say perspective because I hear what you're saying, proving up the facts around police murder and so forth, but we've already kind of like put that category out of our minds. I mean, I'm speaking broadly. I can't like go into the minds of all of my colleagues, but I think that might be kind of what's going on in part. So bringing it back together is maybe I think is relational though. Like I do think that I would be very excited to be sitting in a room, again, that's this room plus 20 to 30 people from the field or 50 people. And just, and when I say the field too, I'm thinking about the field as I normally think about it. Whatever. Like getting people together who are working in these different components and sort of seeing like how to compose strategy together instead of sort of consigning people to different arenas that then get overlooked. That's one thought that I think that that's maybe part of the gap, and we could talk more after about how to do it.
I think this is, I did want to hear from Chantel and Steve, but I also know I need to say a couple of words before I let you all eat, and those of you who have your bags packed, let you grab your lunch. We also have cake. So there's all of those things. But I want to encourage you guys I'm hoping that Steve can stay around a little bit longer. Chantel, I want to thank you so much. You are a trooper for being here. Thank you so much. I want to thank all of our panelists. I really appreciate you standing in from California because I know it's only 9 o'clock there now too. So you came on early and you had a kid with a major injury. So those of us who have had children, really, I really appreciate you being here. But I did want to close out by saying I started this meeting talking about creating a space, a sort of safe space in a way for the more junior scholars to also learn about the hidden curriculum, right? But I think it also, part of where I wanted us to end up was at this point. Because there's only so long you can talk about it, right? Especially people who see themselves as abolitionists. I don't want to endanger your career or jeopardize your path to tenure. You need to do what you need to at your institution, if that's where you want to call tenure your home, because from there, once you get tenure, you wield more power, right? And when you wield more power and you can be a PI and you can get research funding, you can get funding for research, you can do translational work. And there are examples of translational work. I've been actually doing this for the last few years since I got tenure, taking some of my academic research, working with folks specifically at the Urban League now, where I have complicated, long 10 or 15,000 word publications boiled down into either a blog or Rodrigo Martinez is great. He's done I don't know how many white papers at the Urban Institute, right? So there are instances where you can do translational work, right? And that translational work can then be used to talk better, to talk more clearly with funders about a theory of change. So taking your research agenda, or what is called a body of work, this is all urban jargon, but NGO fields generally, the NGO field is generally using this. If you take your body of work or your research agenda, and then you can come up with a theory of change connected to it. Most of us have this already rumbling around in our head, but we have to speak in these very confined ways to make sure we get tenure, right? I was writing for my life for my first book because I kept moving. My son was here a little earlier. He's still mad at me, right? He's 22. He's graduated from high school. He's a graduate student. He's still mad at how many times I had to move in order to stay on a tenure track, right? In spite of all his privilege, I still get crap all the time. But I'm bringing all of this up to say because we make sacrifices. There are sacrifices we have to make in our personal life in order to advance our professional goals, right? And sometimes, especially more junior scholars, you are writing, and most of us in this room have been told, you're doing me-search in some way. And I'm going to bring us back to where I started with Ruben's gift of proximity, right? Our experience, our life experience, our struggles, our noticing, us noticing hurt and pain in our own lives and around others have driven our research questions. We can develop, as we've developed our research agendas or our bodies of work, we can also reflect upon those experiences as we start to do translational work. I really appreciate the tension. Nicole's always going to bring the heat. She's from Chicago. I think she's gang affiliated. I don't know which one she's claiming these days, but yeah, she's always going to bring the heat. I love Nicole for that. And Chloe, I appreciate all of our potential funding partners are the ones who have been here educating us, allowing us to educate them. This was a great panel, a great exchange, and it was also a great day and a half. So enjoy your cake. Happy birthday, Sarah, and safe travels, everybody. Thank you. No, thank you, Steve. Thank you. I will be in touch.
Yes.
I had to get through this.
For sure.
There's a lot of stuff we had to do.
Yep.
But I think I asked about CJARs very specifically.